Rejoin NBC for their nationwide coverage from our Wlw Communications Exchange at this time. Local and regional news of interest. Xavier University in Cincinnati will hold classes Monday morning, concluding with a noon mass. There will be no classes in the afternoon at Xavier University. Classes at the University of Cincinnati for Monday have been canceled. Also, Our Lady of Cincinnati College will be closed Monday, and Miami University of Ohio will have classes on an abbreviated schedule. A 30-day mourning period has been proclaimed in Indiana by Governor Welsh in tribute to President Kennedy. Hoosier schools will be closed at the discretion of the local school authorities in compliance with a request by Governor Welsh. Governor Burt Combs tonight proclaimed Monday an official day of mourning for the state of Kentucky and urged Kentuckians to assemble in their respective places of worship for memorial services to the late President Kennedy. From his offices at the state capitol, Governor Combs further urged all places of commerce in Kentucky either to close for the day or at least for a sufficient time to allow every Kentuckian to attend a memorial service in his place of worship. The governor also requested school administrators to take appropriate action to close all public schools for the day. Our WLW Communications Exchange has been told that all schools in the Cincinnati area, including those in northern Kentucky, public, private, and parochial, will be closed on Monday, as will all schools in Hamilton County, Ohio, be closed. And also, the Milford schools and the public offices in Claremont County, Ohio, will be closed. Governor Burt Combs will leave Frankfort tomorrow night and fly to Washington to attend funeral services for the late president. Flying with Combs in his private plane will be Lieutenant Governor Wilson Wyatt and Governor-elect Edward Breathitt. All post office facilities will be closed Monday because of the death of the president. Post office installations will operate on a holiday basis by order of the Postmaster General at Washington, D.C. No deliveries will be made. All employees required to be on duty during the holiday will be given time off from noon to 1 p.m. during the funeral service period. The annual Ohio State University Football Appreciation Banquet scheduled for Monday night has been postponed until further notice. Now, all 5 of today's football games involving Big Ten teams were canceled, but 3 were rescheduled for later dates. Illinois and Michigan State will have their showdown on Thanksgiving Day, while Wisconsin and Minnesota also play their rescheduled game that day. Purdue will meet Indiana, and Ohio State will play Michigan on November 30th. The game between Notre Dame and Iowa has been canceled because Notre Dame plays Syracuse on Thanksgiving Day. For the regional weather, from our WLW Radar Weather Service, meteorologist Frank Pierce. Frank?
Good evening, everyone. Well, checking the weather now and the progress as the cold air moves to the eastern seaboard. The leading edge is now off of the coastal areas there, or just moving off the coastal areas. And the rains around Washington have once again let up. Most of them are now over. The wind is around to the northwest now, and the temperature has dropped down to 56 degrees. So as we see it now, with the amount of cool air moving into the picture, it'll be gliding across the southern side of our area during the day Sunday. It'll be over in the Virginias as far as come Monday, and that should give a rather bright day for the sad ceremonies that'll be going on in the Washington area on Monday. We'll look for generally fair skies there and temperatures warming up a little bit over what we'll find there tomorrow, which will be much like we're having around here. Back here we are in the 30s, and some of the areas now falling below freezing, such as downtown Cincinnati with 31 and 29 degrees in clear skies in Indiana, at Indianapolis, and 32 at Richmond, 33 at Dayton, Ohio, and Columbus is 36. And the trailing edge of the cloud band is moving into our western regions now. The WLW weather forecast is for the clearing trend to continue on through the night tonight, with some flurries over on the eastern side, or eastern counties of Ohio, no accumulations of snow, and finally into a clear picture tomorrow morning with temperatures in the 20s mostly, about 24 in Cincinnati. During the day on Sunday then, still on the windy side from the west and northwest, The temperatures under partly cloudy skies or partly sunny skies, if you will, generally in the 30s, around 35 to 37 in Cincinnati. It's 31 now, and that's the weather.
And now this is Jim Bollinger at WLW in Cincinnati, returning you for the nationwide coverage to NBC.
Secretary, I beg your pardon, the new president, Lyndon Johnson, has scheduled a meeting in the morning on the situation on South Vietnam. He is to confer tomorrow with our ambassador to the South Vietnam, Henry Cabot Lodge. President Kennedy is to be buried Monday in Arlington National Cemetery. This decision by the Kennedy family, it had been believed earlier that burial would take place at the family plot in Brookline, Massachusetts. Mrs. Kennedy has requested that a contingent of Irish Army be present at her husband's funeral. And the new president, Lyndon Johnson, has scheduled an address before a joint session of Congress on Wednesday. The White House says he will make a major policy speech at 12:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time on that date. Tomorrow at 1 p.m., the late president's body will be moved from the White House in an official cortege to the rotunda of the Capitol, where it will lie in state for 1 day. Members of the president's family, cabinet, government leaders, members of the Supreme Court, Congress, diplomatic representatives of the various foreign nations will be present at the ceremonies placing the body in the state of mourning. The public then will be permitted to file past the bier until 9 p.m. And on Monday, between the hours of 9 and 10 a.m., the public again will be permitted to file past the bier in the Capitol Rotunda. At 11 o'clock, the body is to be moved to St. Matthew's Cathedral in Washington, and at 12 noon, a pontifical requiem mass to be celebrated by Richard Cardinal Cushing, the Archbishop of Boston. And as we said earlier, services at the cathedral to be followed by graveside services and burial in Arlington National Cemetery just across the Potomac River from Washington. We go now back to Washington and NBC's Peter Jfk'S.
Russ, as could be expected, hundreds and thousands of telegrams have arrived, both for the Kennedy family and for the Johnson family. Mrs. Johnson will stay this evening at the Johnson home located on a hill in northwest Washington. Only a few neighbor children are still outside the gates at this hour, but still a number of cars driving by, gawking and taking a look at this rather spectacular home. It's dark now, you can't see too much, but there are some lights, as requested by the Secret Service. 2 or 3 of the neighbors' homes have lights which have been focused on the Johnson home to help them. The home formerly owned by Pearl Mesta, as you may recall, a rather large home, 9 bedrooms. She called it Les Ormes, and when Mr. Johnson moved in, or perhaps it was Mrs. Johnson, decided that French is nice, but we just as soon have English, and they changed it to the Elms. Seated across from me now is a young lady who's done a little checking on the Johnson family in the last few hours. Nancy Dickerson, what can you report?
Well, Pete, like you, I was out at Les Ormes, or the Elms, as you said, very early this morning and have been following the activities ever since. Russ, are you there in New York?
Right here, Nancy.
Yes, indeed.
Tell us about, have you had a chance to see Mrs. Johnson or the new president today?
Well, no, I haven't actually talked with either one of them today. I did see President Johnson last night. He came home, as you know, rather late, and he was preceded by a motorcycle escort, and he drove up the hill leading to their house in Spring Valley, and he was seated on the side, and he waved in acknowledgement. He was with William Moyer, who has been at his side constantly since the tragedy occurred. who also waved, and somehow his jaw seemed to be more set, more determined than ever, which has always been a characteristic of his. It's almost, people have compared him to President Roosevelt, the late FDR, who raised that cut of his jaw and raised his chin, and President Johnson does this sometimes, and I could almost see that last night.
Nancy, you know the Johnson family socially. You followed his career for some time. Tell us what might be the reaction of the two girls to this sudden change of events in the political life of their father.
Well, they're very, very proud of their father and of their mother, too, because she has been as active a campaigner in many ways as any woman in modern political life. But Linda Bird, the oldest daughter, is, as you know, at the University of Texas, and she is probably the least affected human being by living in the glare of publicity that I've ever met. She's completely unaffected, and I think that her first reaction will be a great deal of pride, and her second reaction will be, isn't this fun, isn't this exciting, isn't it, as her mother would say, wonderful to have an eye on the world and history as it occurs. Lucy Baines, the youngest of the two, will also be proud. She is interested in government, and I think that we may expect to see some excitement and gaiety on the part of Lucy Baines Johnson, too.
Nancy, could we call on you to characterize perhaps Mrs. Johnson as the new First Lady? What sort of First Lady will she make?
Well, she's a very, very active woman. She has done many of the things that Mrs. Kennedy was unable to do because of her sicknesses and her busy schedule, and Mrs. Johnson has taken over and done almost everything that any human being could be called. One thing we ought to say about Mrs. Johnson is this. Her real name is Claudia, but she's never been called that. She's always been called Lady Bird, and even in the Congressional Directory, they list her as Mrs. Lady Bird Johnson. Well, Russ, I think that finishes it from here in Washington at this time.
Nancy, we thank you very much. We'll be talking to you a little later, I trust, and to Peter Jfk'S. Right now we have Dean Braylis on the line. It's past midnight in the British capital, and perhaps, Dean, can you hear me?
Yes, I can, Ray.
What is the situation in London at this hour?
Well, the situation at the moment is that the Sunday morning papers have just hit the street here, and they're cast in tribute and mourning for President Kennedy. But the British press is also mentioning for the first time some fears that the United States may now enter a hard, inflexible foreign policy. The reason, anti-communist reaction in the United States. The British are afraid, they say, that such an anti-communist reaction would weaken the Western alliance and possibly harm present East-West relations. Lee Oswald's admitted membership in the Communist Party, says the London Times, has diplomats from Western, communist, and uncommitted states worried. The diplomats suggest that Oswald's communist background could provoke a wave of right-wing extremist reaction in the United States. Throughout the day, London has been a city of profound sorrow. In pubs, on the double-decker buses, in the London clubs, the English reaction has been one of continuing grief and shock, such as the death of no other Western statesman could have shaken England.
Dean, am I correct in the assumption, then, that the British fears of a change in U.S. foreign policy are directed more toward the Oswald youth than they are toward the new president?
Well, it's really a combination of both things. Now, they are headlining this morning that Lee himself is a communist. They're also saying that Khrushchev denies any implication. However, they also have indicated that, and they have called the new president an old New Dealer. Now, the Times is very a little rough on him, I think, this morning. They say one of the most egocentric men in American public life, openly and without apology.
That is how they describe the new president?
They also add that his zest for power is limitless. His killing pace in politics and parliamentary generalship is attributable to the fact that he cares little for the game, but everything for victory. He simply has no interest in arriving at defeat, however skillfully the battle may have been fought. Then the Times continues, and as you remember, Russ, this is a conservative paper. On overseas trips, he telephones Washington daily to find out what the newspapers are saying about him, and is icy to reporters who are stinting in their applause. Yet, with these characteristics, Lyndon Johnson established himself beyond question during his years as Democratic leader in the Senate as the most powerful and effective parliamentary boss Washington had seen in years. I should add, Russ, that the British television satire program, That Was the Week That Was, which usually rips people apart, was actually measured but consistent in its praise of President Johnson. And they especially recall that he was responsible for steering through the first civil rights bill, and that he also engineered very skillfully the congressional actions against McCarthy.
Dean, the language used by the Times seems to me to be quite strong, perhaps too strong. I wonder to what extent this viewpoint is shared by the Douglas Hume government.
Oh, I think that the Douglas Hume government is absolutely entirely with the president. They've expressed privately, in fact, pointedly today, that they were quite sure that the president would follow President Kennedy's foreign policy.
Let me ask you one final question, Dean Braylis. When Sir Alec Douglas Hume comes here for the funeral of the late president, he will, while in Washington, confer with the new president. Would you care to anticipate the 1, 2, or 3 biggest problems that the Prime Minister would have on his mind as he comes to Washington to confer for the first time with Lyndon Johnson?
I suspect that the first thing that would be on his mind would be assurance that the new president would be following the same close rapport that had been established recently between England and the United States. And I think that they have this very much in mind. I think the whole concept of a Western alliance with the late president as the leader had dynamic importance here. And I think that's what's going to be the very beginning of their conversation. I couldn't hazard beyond that, but this is really what they're concerned about here.
Dean, we thank you for this report very much. We'll be in touch with you later in the evening.
Thank you, Russ.
Right now, we might mention, as Dean Braylis pointed out, that Sir Alec Douglas Hume will be meeting with the new president for the first time. A man who has met with him many times in the past is Minnesota's Senator Hubert Humphrey. And for more on Mr. Humphrey, we go back to Washington and Ray Shearer talking with the senator.
Senator Humphrey, we have asked you here to ponder the question which really only history can answer, but we propose to propound it anyway. What sort of a president do you expect Lyndon Johnson to be?
Well, of course, that is truly a question for history. And all that one can do is to venture an opinion from his own experience and his own knowledge of the individual. I've been privileged to know President Lyndon Johnson for many years during all of my service in the United States Senate, and as, of course, during his service as Senator and Vice President. I think President Johnson will be a forceful president. He will be a very hard-working and dedicated man. His life is truly consumed by public service and political life. I expect him to be a very active president, and one that will be very much concerned about programs, action programs, particularly on the domestic scene.
Well, you know him very well. You know his drives, his interests. What does he feel strongly about?
Well, he feels very strongly about this country. Now, that's a broad phrase, and it is a generalization, but he's a great patriot. He loves this nation, and as you know, he thinks a great deal about the security of our nation. He was the chairman of the Subcommittee on Preparedness. He was the chairman of the Subcommittee on State Department and Foreign Aid Appropriations. So in those two subcommittees in the Senate, President Johnson, as a senator, gained a keen insight into matters of national security, of defense, and of foreign policy. And as the vice president serving with our late and beloved President Kennedy, President Johnson became much more intimately acquainted with foreign relations and our international relations. I believe it's fair to say that he feels very strongly about, for example, our commitments to our alliances, the strength of this nation, about the interdependence between a prosperous American economy and the necessary strength that we must have for the long-term leadership that we will have to give the world. And his recent utterances, not so recent either. As a matter of fact, we ought to recall that it was President Johnson who, as Majority Leader of the Senate, guided through the Senate the first civil rights program since the Civil War. He feels strongly about human equality, about equal opportunity. He feels this not only as a political leader, but as a moral commitment. I know this from my personal visits with him.
Senator, on this point, civil rights, is there any basis for assuming that this drawing together, this rallying around the president that we're now seeing will possibly make it easier to put a civil rights program through Congress?
Well, that's very difficult to predict, but I do hope so. I really do hope so. And I have a feeling that that President Johnson will do all that he possibly can to carry through on the policies and the programs of his predecessor. Can I just say a word about that?
Certainly.
You know, many people are worried these days because of the crisis and the tragedy that we face, and this sense of worry and concern is all throughout the world. Our forefathers saw to it that we have a system of government and institutions of democracy that permit orderly transition of power, the transfer of power, without violence or chaos. But in this instance, there's something else. We have a man to follow, a very, very great president, President Kennedy, and in President Johnson, we have one who worked closely with the late and beloved president, not only as a man, but worked with him on program and on policy. I saw this being, as we would say, hammered out on the anvil of political discussion and of thought and philosophy, so that we're going to have a continuity not only of government, but a continuity of basic philosophy and basic political policy at home and abroad. This, to me, is reassuring. Now, both men have their own way of doing things, and President Johnson has his own personality, his own techniques, his own mannerisms, his own ways. But the essentials are there, the essential policy and program and commitment of the late President Kennedy. Those policies and programs live on in the mind and in the heart and in the thinking of President Johnson. I know it because I had the chance to sit with these men for 2.5 years as president and vice president. I was one of the lieutenants in the Senate, and I sat at the same table, and I sat at the same conferences. I believe that I was able to observe a meeting of the minds and a sharing of thought and a cooperation that will live on.
On this point of personality and tactics that you mentioned a moment ago, as Senate Majority Leader, Mr. Johnson established a masterful leadership of the Senate. That's almost universal. Can a president have the same relation to the Senate that a Majority Leader can have?
No, I doubt that. I really doubt it, because the minute a man becomes president, I'm sure he automatically changes. He can't help it, because he has new responsibilities. But it is fair to say that President Johnson has the great respect of the bipartisan leadership of the House and the Senate. I saw this on Friday night when we met with President Johnson after he returned from Texas, when the bipartisan leadership of the House and the Senate joined with him at his office. It wasn't to discuss program, but it was to share thoughts and to feel and to pledge in a personal testimonial our support and our cooperation.
One final question, sir. What do you look for President Johnson to say when he talks to the joint session Wednesday?
Well, I'm really not privy to that message. I've talked with President Johnson about some of his plans very briefly. I'm sure that he will reassure the whole world of our commitments to the United Nations, to our alliances, to the cause of human freedom, and to the cause of peace. I've heard President Johnson speak eloquently in the cause of peace. I've heard him speak with moving philosophy and thought in the cause of human rights, as he did on the 4th of July of this year at Gettysburg. I'm sure that he will tell the nation and the whole world that America goes on, that the ideals of American liberty and our pledge to freedom and human dignity carry on, and that he, as the President of the United States, will try to carry on the work that has been so nobly advanced, in the words of Lincoln, by the late and beloved President Kennedy. There's quite a similarity here. This is the 100th year of emancipation, the centennial year. We lost the great emancipator, Abraham Lincoln, succeeded by a President Johnson. I think we've lost a second great emancipator in President Kennedy, and succeeded now by a very able, dedicated, patriotic, gifted President Johnson.
Thank you, Senator Humphrey. You're very gracious to come by on this evening of sorrow.
Our thanks to Senator Hubert Humphrey and to NBC's Ray Shearer for this moving report on the new President of the United States, Lyndon B. Johnson. Late word from Dallas is that Governor John Connally, who was wounded when President Kennedy was assassinated, will send his 17-year-old son to Mr. Kennedy's funeral as his personal representative. That from the governor's staff in Dallas. The boy is John B. Connally III. The governor's aides at Parkland Hospital in Dallas also have said that Lieutenant Governor Preston Smith, Texas Attorney General Wagner Carr, and Texas House Speaker Byron Tonnell will be in the official party that comes here. Eugene Locke of Dallas, the chairman of the State Democratic Executive Committee, also will be in attendance. Governor Connally is reported to be in satisfactory condition this evening at the Parkland Hospital. Physicians say the 46-year-old governor was expected to suffer no disabling effects from the bullet wound he received when President Kennedy was slain. Connally will remain hospitalized for 10 days to 2 weeks. The governor and Mrs. Connally were riding in the seat ahead of the president and Mrs. Kennedy yesterday when the sniper's bullet struck the president in the head. The governor turned to see what had happened to the president and was struck in the back by another bullet. There's a certain bit of irony in the events of yesterday. Approximately 30 hours ago, just before the president was shot, Mrs. Connally, the wife of the Texas governor, commented on the size and the enthusiasm of the welcome. She turned to the president and said, "You can't say Dallas wasn't friendly to you." Dallas, a city noted for the strength of its extreme right-wing movement, there had been fears that the right wing would demonstrate against the president, claiming he was too liberal, yet the accused in the assassination is to the far left wing, or the man who has been charged with the murder. Every president of the United States elected on the 20th year since the year 1840 has died in office, and no other president has ever died in office. The new president of the United States is the second President Johnson, and the last one also got his post as the result of an assassin's bullet. In that case, it was the bullet that killed Abraham Lincoln. The bullet wounds that killed President Kennedy and Abraham Lincoln were almost identical head wounds. Some of the ironies in the death of John Fitzgerald Kennedy. This is Russ Ward, reporting from the NBC newsroom in New York.
You are listening to NBC's continuous coverage of the events surrounding the death of the late President of the United States, John Fitzgerald Kennedy.
This other news we bring you now. First from Norwalk, Ohio, 63 persons missing and presumed dead today in Norwalk in a fire that swept a path of devastation through a nursing home for the aged, infirmed, and mentally ill. 24 others rescued. The blaze destroyed the 10-year-old Golden Age nursing home near Fitchville, about 15 miles southwest of Norwalk, Ohio. The one-story concrete building burned quickly, fed by a propane gas tank and tar roofing. A brisk wind had fanned the flames, thwarting the efforts of firefighters. 63 persons missing and presumed dead. Aldous Leonard Huxley, the British novelist, biographer, and essayist, died in Los Angeles at his home of cancer. He was 69 years of age. Private funeral services were held there today. Death came yesterday to Huxley, who had lived for many years in Los Angeles and was one of the intellectual leaders of the West Coast. His lectures at the universities in the West were well attended. He is survived by his widow, Laura, a son, Matthew, and a brother, Sir Julian. Death claiming 69-year-old Aldous Leonard Huxley in Los Angeles yesterday. Controller James J. Saxon has given his approval today for the closing of banks on Monday, the National Day of Mourning, proclaimed by President Lyndon Johnson. Saxon has urged bank employees and banks to take that action where the law allows it. He goes on to say it is in the presumption that this office that all national banks will appropriately observe the clear non-business implications of the President's proclamation by the adoption of suitable action. There will be no postal deliveries on Monday, and post offices generally will be closed. President Johnson having proclaimed Monday as a national day of mourning. Postmaster General John Gronowski announced the closing tonight, but has said he had authorized all postmasters to make available certain essential mail services to meet urgent community needs. In such cases, limited window services will be provided for business mailers. No postal service will be available between the hours of 12 noon and 1 p.m. on Monday, the time of the Requiem Mass for John F. Kennedy. The United Nations will be closed on Monday, November the 25th. The UN will even be closed to visitors on that day. The UN General Assembly will meet Tuesday morning to pay formal tribute to the late president. Under arrangements announced today at UN headquarters, the meetings of all the other bodies of the World Organization will be suspended until Tuesday afternoon. The date of an important Security Council session on South Africa's policies of apartheid, scheduled originally for Monday, still uncertain. Secretary General U Thant, who yesterday led a host of saddened UN diplomats in sending messages of condolences to the bereaved First Family, will head a group of top-level United Nations dignitaries at Monday's funeral services in Washington. Accompanying U Thant will be Carlos Sosa Rodriguez of Venezuela and other high-ranking UN officials. The blue and white United Nations flag fluttered at half-staff here in New York today. The UN announced that it would remain so for the next 3 days. The national flags of the 111 UN members will not be displayed during that period of mourning. The first working meetings of the various UN committees since their suspension on the news of the president's assassination will be held Tuesday afternoon following the morning assembly plenary session devoted to eulogies. It still is not known when the Security Council will meet on that question of South African apartheid. Mrs. Kennedy's younger sister, Lee Radziwill, has arrived at the White House following the plane trip from London to be with Mrs. Kennedy and to attend the funeral of her brother-in-law. This is Russ Ward, NBC News, New York.
The NBC radio network has canceled all regularly scheduled programs to bring you this continuous coverage of the events surrounding the death of the late President of the United States, John F. Kennedy. We will be on the air with this continuous coverage until 11 p.m. Eastern Standard Time tonight. We will begin our continuous coverage on Sunday morning at 8 a.m. Eastern Standard Time and on Monday morning at 7 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. We pause now for station identification.
This is the Nation Station, WLW in Cincinnati.
This is Russ Ward in New York as we continue our NBC News coverage of the events surrounding the death of President John F. Kennedy. Authorities in Dallas, Texas now tell us that they have in their possession photographs showing a 24-year-old ex-Marine holding the rifle that killed the late president. From Washington, burial now scheduled for Arlington National Cemetery, just across the Potomac River, on Monday following the Requiem High Mass for the former president. For more of the Washington story, we go now to NBC's Peter Jfk'S.
One of the questions that has been asked, at least we have heard it here and there, and perhaps it is being asked all over the country, is why the casket containing the remains of the late president is closed, sealed, with the American flag draped over it, and not, as in some instances, open so it can be viewed. Generally, I am not a Catholic, but I am told that it is accepted practice by Catholic families to have a closed casket, although this is not always true, and there is no strict church rule about it. But in this country, it has been a generally accepted practice that the casket is not open. One of the interesting sidelights to the new President Johnson is and his family is the possibility that we may shortly have a White House wedding, the first time in a good many years. His older daughter, Linda, is 19 years old. She's a sophomore at the University of Texas in Austin, and she is engaged to a young Navy ensign named Bernard Rosenbach. And the expectation, of course, here is that within the not too distant future, there could be at least a wedding at the White House. NBC's Richard Hartness, Russ, has been looking into the legalities surrounding the case of the man arrested in connection with Mr. Kennedy's death. Dick?
Well, as you know, Peter, much of the news today has revolved about that man being held in Dallas, Lee Harvey Oswald. I have been, as you say, doing some research, talking to legal authorities here in Washington. When he called today for John Abt, that's spelled A-B-T for his lawyer, rang a bell with me, and I did a bit of research. I find that the congressional publication, which is entitled Communist Legal Subversion, The Role of the Communist Lawyer, was published by the House Committee on Un-American Activities in February of 1959. I find that this record is full of mentions of John Abt. For instance, Whittaker Chambers, that man who had been a communist spy, testified that in the early 1930s, this John Abt was a member of a communist cell of government lawyers here in Washington. The purpose of the cell members, according to Whittaker Chambers, was to work themselves into policy-making positions in the New Deal, and that espionage was their final objective. Others named were Lee Pressman, who admitted being a Communist Party member, and Alger Hiss, of course, who is well known for his conviction on charges of perjury for denying that he had passed State Department secrets to Russia. Now, in the government, Abt worked in the 1930s during this period in the legal division of the old Agricultural Adjustment Organization, old AAA, back in the Agriculture Department, and also was in the Antitrust Division of the Justice Department at one time. He was convicted and connected with communist... No, he was not convicted. He was connected with communist fronts, according to this publication, such as the People's Congress, and then he was a delegate to Prague to a meeting of the World Federation of Trade Unions, which was the communist-sponsored world labor movement. Then even a more direct tie with the Communist Party came only last year, as recently as December of last year. John Abt represented the Communist Party in that trial here in Washington where the party was convicted for failing to register as a foreign agent. Now, on the Oswald case itself, as the police in Dallas have disclosed the evidence in bits and pieces today, that evidence seems to comes together this way, that his wife said that he had owned a rifle similar to the one used by the sniper who shot President Kennedy. And the police know that Oswald bought a rifle for $12.78 from a mail-order house. The police say that that order was in Oswald's handwriting. The rifle was not in its accustomed place in a garage where he normally kept it. Police say that they found the death rifle in a room overlooking the assassination site. Then paraffin tests for gunpowder on his hands were positive, according to the police. And then, as Russ Ward reported only a moment ago, the police disclosed that they now had a photograph of Oswald posing with the rifle and with a pistol used to slay a pursuing policeman after the assassination. Now, on the legal ramifications of the Oswald case and his forthcoming trial, I talked to outstanding legal authority here in Washington. He made these points. He said that Oswald, of course, must be tried by a jury. And this poses a not too difficult problem because the judge can handle the matter of a prejudiced juror by following one of three alternatives. First, he can switch the place of the trial, say to Houston, if he's convinced that Oswald could not get a fair trial in Dallas, and or he could, number two, say that it will do no good to grant a change of venue. And then third, and most likely, he could grant a continuance of this trial until the burning indignation dies down. And if he follows that course, a conviction undoubtedly would stand up in any of those three cases. However, the way the case is actually being handled in Dallas, as my legal friend sees it, is flirting with danger. There was, for instance, the statement by the Dallas police chief that Oswald's case is a cinch. Well, such statements like that might prejudice the trial in the eyes of some appeals court. Also, television film has been somewhat objectionable from a legal standpoint to a fair trial. Apparently, the only way to move Oswald through the jail where he's being held is to take him through a corridor, which, of course, is always jammed with cameramen and reporters. So the public, and, of course, the public of prospective jurors down in Dallas, they hear questions shouted at Oswald by the newsmen. They see him pushed and banged into the wall by the crowd. Now, there may be a parallel here developing to a Louisiana murder case in which the Supreme Court ruled last year. It seems that a Louisiana suspect in a murder case was filmed making a confession. The film was then shown on television at least twice in Louisiana prior to the man's trial and conviction. The Supreme Court here in Washington then set aside the conviction on the basis of that televised confession. Now, my lawyer friend is convinced that the Dallas police are trying to wring a confession from Oswald, and if one is obtained, that there can be serious legal doubts about his confession and possibly create a case, if he confesses and then is convicted, that could be lead to an appeals court, and possibly the case could end up in the United States Supreme Court as the Louisiana murder case did. My source, this legal expert here in Washington, feels, Russ, that the case is heading that way, possibly.
Dick, if you're still there for a moment, let me ask you, this may be a technical point, but should Oswald's defense request a change of venue, would it be possible to move the case out of the state of Texas?
Russ, I'm not an attorney. I'm not sure whether it would or not. I think normally, doesn't it have to stay within the jurisdiction of the court?
That's my understanding.
If we're wrong, we'll get a great number of letters from attorneys across the country, I assure you of that.
I'll be happy to allow you to answer them. Since he is charged with a state crime, that is,
That's right.
the crime of murder,
Yes.
it would seem to me that he would have to be tried in... Of course, I trust the public doesn't think we're pre-trying this case on radio. But
I'm sure, Russ, that the case could not be taken, say, to Louisiana
Yes.
or any other state.
I do have further word from Dallas, Dick and Peter. Oswald now has been charged with attempting to kill Texas Governor John Connally. This is the third charge brought against him, that of murdering the president, of killing that Dallas policeman, and now with attempted murder on the life of Governor Connally.
Yes.
This last charge filed just this afternoon. Peter, did you have anything you can add to this legal discussion we have going?
Not specifically, Russ. We discussed this earlier, Jim Hurlbut and I, and the question arose without any answers, of course, neither of us being legal minds or legally trained, as to just how much of a fair trial, legally speaking, this fellow can expect, because of the fact that our communications today are what they are. Within minutes of what happens, as a matter of fact, even as it's happening, the people not only of the general area of Dallas, but of the entire country are watching it either live or momentarily. And the question that I raised, and Jim had no answer, nor do I, from a legal standpoint, won't it be rather difficult to pick a jury which Mr. Oswald's attorneys feel are not prejudiced in advance? It will be difficult.
I would imagine it would be impossible, because the name, the face, the voice, and the story have been carried on all broadcast radio and television for many hours now.
Well, this is a problem for legal minds, a very delicate one, and obviously the presiding judge in the case is going to have to be very careful because of all of the ramifications of appeals and legal technicalities which would then ensue.
Peter, on another subject, was Ambassador Lodge at the White House today? Do you know?
That I do not know. I haven't been able to check that out. It's quite possible. Incidentally, Russ, have you noticed that President Johnson is being listed officially as the 36th President of the United States? He's actually, the 35th man. And the explanation is very simple. We seem to go through this every inaugural and every campaign and every election. The rather obvious explanation is that Democrat Grover Cleveland served 2 terms, but not successively, not consecutively. So Cleveland is listed both as the 22nd president and also as the 24th president. So Mr. Johnson is listed as the 2nd President Johnson and the 36th President of the United States. There is a communication which apparently has arrived here in Washington from the gentleman who came into an international spotlight not long ago when President Johnson was on a tour of Pakistan back in 1961. Our old friend, the camel driver, Bashir Ahmad, you may remember him. He has not only expressed deep sorrow at the death of President Kennedy and wished President Johnson well, but he's quoted as follows, and I think perhaps the translation has improved the speech of the camel driver, but I'll quote it. He says, "I hope and pray that my friend Johnson will rise to the occasion and adequately fill the vacuum created by President Kennedy's death." A very noble thought, and I'm sure received in just in the spirit it was sent. The camel driver met with the president in mid-1961 when he came to Washington. As a matter of fact, he had met with President Johnson before that, when he as vice president went to Pakistan, and then he came to this country and met with the late President Kennedy and again with the new president, Mr. Johnson.
Peter, allow me to interrupt here. We have Tom Perryman in Dallas on the line, and he has a continuation of this Lee Harvey Oswald story. We'll call in Tom right now.
Thank you, Russ. Well, here in Dallas, we had a man, Travis Lynn, was down at the Dallas Police Headquarters, and he noted from the police blotter, the report sheet, that the police always fill out when there's a homicide or a theft or anything else in the
police work nature. These reports are filled out on everything that takes place with all the facts. And we have a recording here, 1 minute and 27 seconds long, we want you to hear. It goes like this.
Whenever an offense is committed in the city of Dallas, a homicide report is made out in case it is a murder, commonly called a beef sheet at police headquarters. There is now one on the assassination of President Kennedy. It reads in this fashion. Last name of person killed, Kennedy, John F., in parentheses, President of U.S., white male, 47, Washington, D.C., residence of person killed, White House. Serial number, felony offense 85950. Offense as reported, murder. Place of occurrence, Elm Street, approximately 150 feet west of Houston. Division, Homicide and Robbery, Platoon 2, Beat 101. Officers making report, C.N. Doherty and H.H. Blessing, Dallas Police Department. Day of week, Friday, 11/22/63 at 12:30 p.m. Coroner notified Joe B. Brown, pronounced dead by Dr. Kemp Clark at 1 p.m. Parkland Hospital. A description of the offense, the expired was riding in motorcade with wife and Governor John Connolly and his wife. Witnesses heard gunshot and saw expired slump forward. More shots were heard and expired fell into wife's lap. Governor Connolly also was shot at this time. Car in which they were riding was escorted to Parkland Hospital by Dallas police officers. Person arrested, Lee Harvey Oswald, white male, 25. Arresting officers, Lieutenant E.L. Cunningham and M.N. McDonald, patrolman. Charge, murder.
And that's the official report from Dallas Police Headquarters. One final note, Russ. Oswald will be transferred to the county jail at 10 o'clock in the morning. It was thought he might be transferred tonight, but late word from police headquarters indicates he'll be taken over to the county jail, just literally feet away from where the assassination took place, at 10 o'clock in the morning.
Tom, when Oswald was seized at the theater there, we got reports of this large crowd of people shouting, "Lynch him." Am I correct in that?
There were similar statements. There was a photographer quoted as saying something along that line, like, "I hope you burn," or something along that line. I don't believe there was any connection to the assassination at the time. Oswald, when arrested at the theater, is alleged to have pulled a pistol. He was unable to fire on officers who arrested him after running 4 or 5 blocks after allegedly killing the policeman about 4 or 5 blocks from the theater. There was a woman and a photographer quoted in dispatches that made statements similar to those you described.
Have there been any other outbursts of public indignation directed specifically toward this man since that initial arrest?
Well, public officials and anyone involved in it have certainly expressed sorrow and not exactly madness at this person. They call him a maniac and a nut, but as far as any public gathering in the streets, something along that line, a lynch mob, no.
Yeah, that's what I mean. Persons gathering outside the quarters where he's being held.
No, there were several hundred people waiting this afternoon for his transfer to the county jail. But as we say, he won't be transferred there. I suppose 1,000, 2,000 persons were lining ropes and barricades set up by police near the county jail, along with 50 or 60 reporters waiting to take his picture if he appeared. But he won't be, and the people, I suppose, have dispersed by now, or most of them have.
We understand Oswald lost some of what was described earlier as his arrogant air after he had seen the photographs of himself with the rifle that is being held. Do you have any further enlightenment on that?
Yes, he made a statement over in Police Captain Will Fritz's office to the effect that he wanted a lawyer. He was seeking the lawyer from New York, Mr. Apt, who has represented people with communistic backgrounds, and he appeared to have calmed down some.
Tom, we thank you for this report from Dallas, and we'll be in touch with you throughout the evening.
Right.
A brief recap here. The White House announcing that John F. Kennedy is to be buried at Arlington National Cemetery outside Washington on Monday, following the Requiem Mass to be held at St. Matthew's Cathedral in the capital city. President Lyndon Johnson has held his first cabinet meeting, a meeting opened with a minute of silent prayer. The White House says Mr. Johnson will address a joint session of Congress Wednesday, 12:30 p.m., Washington time. We go immediately back to Dallas now and the police chief there with further details on this murder weapon.
Chief Curry, I understand you have some new information in this case. Could you relate what that is?
Yes, we've just been informed by the Federal Bureau of Investigation that they, the FBI, have the order letter from a mail order house, and this the order was sent to their laboratory in Washington, and the writing on this order was compared with known samples of our suspect Oswald's handwriting and found to be the same.
This order was for the rifle?
This order was for the rifle to a mail order house in Chicago. It was, the return address was to Dallas, Texas, to the post office box under the name of A. Hidell, Hidell. This is the post office box of our suspect. This gun was mailed parcel post on March the 20th, 1963. I understand he left Dallas shortly after this and didn't come back until, I think, about 2 months ago.
Do you know, again, on what date this rifle was ordered, and are you able to link it definitely as the rifle which you confiscated at the schoolbook depository?
That we have not done so far. If the FBI has been able to do it, I have not been informed of it yet. We do know that this man ordered a rifle of the type that was used in the assassination of the president from this mail order house in Chicago, and the FBI has definitely identified the writing as that of our suspect.
On another subject, I understand you have photographs of the suspect Oswald with a rifle like that used. Could you describe that picture?
Well, this is a picture of Oswald standing facing a camera with a rifle in his hand, which is very similar to the rifle that we have in our possession. He also had a pistol strapped on his hip. He was holding two papers in his hand, which one of them seemed to be the worker. The other says, be militant, or I don't know whether that was headlines or the name of the paper.
How much did the gun cost from the mail order house?
I understand the gun was advertised for $12.78, I believe.
Have you received any results on the ballistics test conducted on the gun and on Oswald?
They're going to be favorable. I don't have a formal report yet.
But you are sure at this time they will be favorable?
Yes.
Do you feel now that you have the case completely wrapped up, or are you continuing?
We will continue as long as there's a shred of evidence to be gathered. We have a strong case at this time.
I believe you said early this afternoon that you have a new development which does wrap up the case. The first time you said the case definitely is secure. Is that correct?
That was this morning. This additional evidence just makes a stronger case.
But this is not the same evidence you're referring to then?
No, that's true.
Will you be willing to say what that evidence was?
No, sir, I don't wish to reveal it. It might jeopardize our case.
Thank you very much. Chief Jesse Curry of the Dallas Police Department.
Chief Curry describing the murder weapon as a $12.78 gun purchased from a mail-order house in Chicago. We are standing by in Washington with further information on this weapon. We switch now to Peter Hackus in Washington.
Russ, I think we've had another breakdown in communications. I have no further information on the weapon. I had one little sidebar to add to the ceremony, the upcoming ceremony. The Kennedy family has asked the Irish government to supply an honor guard of troops for the late president's funeral on Monday, and the request has been approved. A squad of 30 Irish soldiers under the command of General Sean McCune, the head of Ireland's armed forces, will arrive here in Washington tomorrow night, and they will be in the city to take part in the funeral. They will arrive on the same plane which carries the Irish president, Eamon de Valera.
Peter, thank you. We have word from New Haven, Connecticut, that the Yale-Harvard football game that had been scheduled for today will be played at the Yale Bowl in New Haven next Saturday. This announcement made following a decision reached by the two university presidents, Nathan Pusey of Harvard and Kingman Brewster Jr. of Yale. The game had been called off yesterday afternoon That is this afternoon, out of respect for the memory of the late president, the decision to postpone the game and the myriad social activities surrounding it. This is Russ Ward, NBC News, New York.
You are listening to NBC's continuous coverage of the events surrounding the death of the late President of the United States, John Fitzgerald Kennedy.
Another recap now as we look back over the events of the past few hours surrounding the death of the late president. John Kennedy to receive a hero's burial Monday in Arlington National Cemetery just across the Potomac River from Washington. As Commander-in-Chief of the nation's armed forces, the president had abundant right to a grave in the honored military cemetery, both a veteran and a war hero as well. During World War II, as a Navy lieutenant, John Kennedy commanded a PT that was rammed and wrecked by an enemy craft. It was through his heroic efforts that his men were rescued. Burial to follow a pontifical requiem mass at Washington's St. Matthew's Cathedral at noon on Monday, Washington time. Monday to be a day of mourning across the nation and around the world. President Lyndon B. Johnson has appealed to the American people to go to their respective houses of worship for prayer. He also invited all people everywhere to share this nation's grief and to join in the mourning. The new president will make a major policy speech before both houses of Congress on Wednesday. The White House announced the speech will be delivered at 12:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Today, President Johnson held his first cabinet meeting and proclaimed Monday a day of mourning for the dead president. The half-hour cabinet meeting in the White House opened with a minute of silent prayer for Mr. Kennedy. In his proclamation, Mr. Johnson asked Americans to pay tribute to President Kennedy on Monday, the day of his funeral. He also ordered the federal government to close its offices on that day. Mr. Johnson met with two former presidents today, Harry Truman and Dwight Eisenhower, and he consoled the widowed First Lady and the two Kennedy children. It's expected President Johnson will pursue the legislative policies of his predecessor. Any changes in his policies are not expected to show up for January when he makes his first State of the Union message. It is expected President Johnson's congressional background will put him on a solid footing in getting his programs through Congress. Some observers are saying he might be able to get Congress to act on the programs of President Kennedy, which currently are being held back. Congress to meet for regular sessions Tuesday and in a joint session Wednesday to hear the new president. The House Speaker, John McCormick, says the House will work briefly on Wednesday and adjourn then until Friday after Thanksgiving. Senate Democratic Majority Leader Mike Mansfield says the workload might mean the Senate will have to meet Thursday on Thanksgiving Day. Tomorrow, President Johnson has scheduled a top-level meeting with Henry Cabot Lodge, U.S. Ambassador to South Vietnam. Also attending the 3 o'clock meeting will be Defense Secretary McNamara, Secretary of State Dean Rusk, and McGeorge Bundy, Special Presidential Advisor on National Security. More on the man now being held in Dallas, Texas, in connection with the assassination of the president, 24-year-old Lee Harvey Oswald. In an interview in New York, lawyer John App was asked tonight about undertaking the defense of Oswald. He said, quote, "I don't see how it would be possible to undertake a case of this magnitude." He said he had not been asked to do so, and he added, "It would have to be a very serious decision." Apt went on to say, "I have a very heavy litigation schedule." He declared that assuming the Oswald case would not be fair to his other clients. 24-year-old Lee Harvey App being held by Dallas authorities on 3 charges. Lee Harvey Oswald being held in Dallas on 3 charges: the assassination of President Kennedy, the murder of a Dallas policeman, and attempted murder on the life of Governor John Connally of Texas. Continuous coverage coming your way on the events surrounding the death of the president. This is Russ Ward, NBC News, New York.
As you know, the NBC radio network has canceled all regularly scheduled programs to bring you this continuous coverage of the events surrounding the death of the late President of the United States, John F. Kennedy. We will be on the air with this continuous coverage until 11 p.m. Eastern Standard Time tonight. We will begin our continuous coverage on Sunday morning at 8 a.m. Eastern Standard Time and on Monday morning at 7 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. Now we pause for station identification.
WLW in Cincinnati and the Crosley Broadcasting Corporation join our listeners in an expression of deep sorrow.
We continue now with our coverage on this period, 31 hours and 30 minutes following the death of John F. Kennedy. And we go first to NBC's John Wlw-Radio for reaction from Miami.
Cuban Prime Minister Fidel Castro is now speaking over Havana radio and talking about the death of President Kennedy. Fidel has lamented the fact that the assassination took place. He said that while both President Kennedy and President Eisenhower were hostile to the Cuban Revolution, nevertheless, an act of assassination is grave and bad. Castro opened his speech with a review of the actions of the Kennedy administration during the Bay of Pigs invasion. He has said that Kennedy's death will have great repercussions upon the rest of Latin America. Castro was an hour late in beginning his speech, which is now being broadcast over Havana television and radio stations and being monitored here in Miami. He continues to speak. This is John Wlw-Radio, NBC News in Miami.
Thank you, John, for that report. We get further reaction now as we go to various capitals around the world on reaction to the death of the president. Let's hear from NBC's John Chancellor in Berlin.
From our vantage point here in West Berlin, several important themes of communist reaction emerged today in connection with the death of the president. The point of most immediate importance to the people of the United States is that the Cold War apparently is not going to turn hot overnight because John F. Kennedy is gone and Lyndon Johnson has taken his place. There are several reasons for this. One is the great length to which Premier Khrushchev of the Soviet Union has gone to demonstrate his sorrow and shock over the death of the president. He was echoed in these sentiments by the highest range of Soviet officials, including an influential and unofficial personality, Mrs. Khrushchev. Premier Khrushchev went beyond telegraphing his condolences. Moscow let it be known that he returned today, especially from an out-of-town trip, so that he could call on the American ambassador in Moscow for a personal demonstration of his feelings. On top of that, the Soviets are sending First Deputy Premier Anastas Mikoyan to President Kennedy's funeral. Mikoyan serves a double purpose. He is an old and canny Armenian negotiator who has always got along well with Americans, and he is a man of exalted rank in the Soviet hierarchy. Moreover, the governmental leaders of the East Bloc satellites and their propaganda organizations have been relatively profuse in their messages of condolence and their reporting of the president's death. This applies to some very tough characters in the communist world, including Antonin Novotny of Czechoslovakia and Walter Ulbricht of East Germany. Both have sent messages to Washington, and the leading newspaper in East Germany, Neues Deutschland, turned over a remarkably large portion of its front page today to the Kennedy story. In Moscow, the Russians have borrowed film of Mr. Kennedy from the American Embassy vaults, and a special obituary program on the late president is now being prepared for Moscow television. Among other important things to recall, however, about the communist position is the fact, which must be exceedingly uncomfortable to the communists, is the fact that the man accused of murdering Mr. Kennedy has described himself as a Marxist and, according to one report, as a communist. Furthermore, the man has lived in the Soviet Union and married a Russian girl. This poses a propaganda hurdle of gigantic magnitude for the communists, who were quick off the mark to charge that the president had been killed by a right-wing American racist. So far, the communists have not tried to get over the hurdle, and no one in the Soviet Union, for example, has been told these details about Lee Harvey Oswald. But the voice of America is no longer jammed in Russia, and the people of that country are bound to get the word one way or another. So the Russians there have a bad problem. Finally, In their eulogies to the president, the universal communist line is that the world has lost a man who was working toward a relaxation of international tension. And of course, so he was. But by this tactic, the communists are making it possible to say, look, we got along with President Kennedy, and we said so, but we can't get along with President Johnson. The Russians can say that if they want to. We don't know if they will or not. All we can say now is that on the basis of the evidence here tonight, the Cold War will not get a lot hotter tomorrow. John Chancellor, NBC News, Berlin.
As Chancellor mentioned in his report from Berlin, the name Lee Harvey Oswald is being heard in that divided city as it is here in this country. Oswald now facing 3 charges: the assassination of President Kennedy, the death of a Dallas, Texas policeman, and attempted murder on the life of Texas Governor John Connally. Oswald once warned the Navy Department that he would, quote, employ all means to right the gross mistake or injustice that he contended had been done to him. The Texan, charged with assassinating the president and attempted murder on the life of the governor, had been complaining about an undesirable discharge he received from the Marine Corps after he had gone on inactive status as a hardship case, only to ultimately wind up. His warning was in a letter from Minsk to the Soviet Union, in the Soviet Union, apparently sent back in January of 1962 and misdated January 1961. That letter addressed to John B. Connally, Jr. as Secretary of the Navy. The 24-year-old Oswald had asserted during a New Orleans radio interview on August 21st of that year, or rather of this year, that he was a Marxist and thus different from a communist. But yesterday, Police Chief Jesse Curry of Dallas quoted him as having told police interrogators that he was a member of the Communist Party. The Communist Party, incidentally, has issued a statement here in New York categorically denying any association with Oswald. The statement declared the assassination, quote, could only be the work of a mentally deranged person or the deliberate deed of an enemy of democracy, an agent of the ultra-right advocates of violence. We have more reaction to the death of the president now as we hear from Charles Morgan in San Francisco.
This was a year in which San Francisco merchants had hoped to rush the Christmas season a week, inaugurating it today. Well, there was no festive air here. It was only gloom, physical gloom, which joined in the weeping of San Franciscans. The skies cried all day. Emotional gloom which naturally gripped everyone. Department store windows throughout the city were unlighted. All displays were removed from the windows of I. Magnum, the leading high-fashion store. In each was a pillar topped with a vase of American Beauty roses. One window of the White House department store contained a huge scroll containing the 23rd Psalm, "The Lord is my shepherd." The NBC correspondent watched several men and women break up and incidentally joined them. In the window of a fashionable men's store, there was a Catholic missal open to the pages containing the Requiem Mass, a rosary draped across it. Each Christmas season, the City of Paris department store mounts in its main rotunda a huge tree resplendent with decorations and lights. The lights were dark today, as if in embarrassment at the gaudy display. The Temple Bar, one of the city's most prominent and swinging watering places, was closed tight last night. Its doors bear today wreaths of mourning. The popular restaurants in Maiden Lane will close on Monday, as will restaurants throughout the city. Most noticeable in downtown San Francisco was the absence of children whom fond parents had hoped to bring to Santa Claus, and the few Santa Clauses on hand didn't have their hearts in their work. The wet, chilly streets of San Francisco are poetically reflective of the mood of gloom which permeates this city. Charles Morgan, NBC News, San Francisco.
That reaction from the West Coast on the death of former President Kennedy, the reaction there and around the country has been one of profound grief. It certainly was evidenced on this Saturday afternoon, a day of traditional collegiate sports and other festive activities, but today less than 1/4 of about 50 major college football games that had been scheduled took place. Only Pimlico, of the 5 thoroughbred racing tracks operating, conducted its meeting. All 3 harness racing tracks were closed in the New York area. 2 of the 4 National Association basketball games scheduled for tonight were postponed. A National Hockey League game in Toronto was to go on, but one of the 3 games scheduled for Sunday night was called off. The Cajun Golf Classic at Lafayette, Louisiana, postponed its 3rd round until Sunday, when the 36 holes of play will be completed in that tournament. We repeat from Dallas a bulletin we had earlier this evening. Dallas police tonight saying they now have in their possession photographs showing Lee Harvey Oswald holding the rifle that killed President Kennedy. Oswald now charged with murdering the president, with killing a Dallas policeman, now with attempted murder on the life of Texas Governor John Connally. This last charge, assault with intent to murder Connally, filed just this afternoon. John Fitzgerald Kennedy's 2 small children were told last night that their father was dead. It is not known what words were used to make them understand, nor who performed the task. It is to be assumed that it was their mother, Mrs. Jacqueline Kennedy, who was close beside her husband from the moment he was killed by that assassin's bullet until he returned home to the White House for the last time during the early hours of this morning. His body now lying in the east room of the Executive Mansion. Mrs. Kennedy spent most of the night at the Bethesda Naval Hospital, where the slain president had been taken from Andrews Air Force Base when it arrived in the capital city. She rode in that ambulance with the body and remained at the hospital from 7 o'clock last night until 4 o'clock this morning. Her children were taken from the White House to the nearby home of Mrs. Hugh Auchincloss, their maternal grandmother, late yesterday afternoon. Following dinner in the Auchincloss residence, Caroline and John Jr. returned to the White House private quarters. They went upstairs about 7:30 with their nurse, Maud Shaw, who has been with the Kennedys since Caroline was just 11 days old. John Jr. to be 3 years old on Monday. His father's funeral to take place that day as the whole nation observes a day of national mourning. We'll have more news for you in just a moment.
Tomorrow night, Sunday, starting at 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, NBC Radio will present a special memorial program entitled The Highest Price, a 4-hour documentary of the life and times of our late President John Fitzgerald Kennedy, and an evaluation of the impact on history of his life and death. The Highest Price, tomorrow night, Sunday, at 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, on the NBC Radio Network.
Nobel Prize-winning author John Steinbeck said today the late president, quote, spearheaded all the liberal passions during his time in the White House. I dare to say there was no citizen he did not care about, said Steinbeck. He was enormously popular, and that's why the assassination doesn't make sense. Though not close, of course, I knew him, said Steinbeck. He invited me to the inauguration and to the White House. He was the first president in recent times who had a strong interest in writing, thinking, and in all the arts. Steinbeck goes on to say he had a fantastic mind. He could read a page like a photograph. He seemed to have read everything. In his house there was informality and graciousness, and I think you know his public aspect, so I won't comment on that, says the author. It was a terrible job he had. It was an awful job. It was a killing job. And on top of that, he had personal tragedy in his own family. Those words from Nobel Prize-winning author John Steinbeck, issued late today concerning the death of the late president. He made his remarks in Warsaw as he addressed a number of Polish journalists. For more reaction from around the nation now, we hear from Bill Wood, station KENO in Las Vegas.
Las Vegas, America's entertainment capital and a city not generally noted for compassionate demonstrations, was dark last night for the first time in the memory of many local reporters. Showrooms in the spectacular casino hotels were shut down shortly after the news of the assassination of the president was announced. Old hands on the Vegas scene were actually shocked to see the marquees along the famous strip go dark, as it is often said that nothing short of an A-bomb could stop the 24-hour entertainment and lavish shows designed to lure gamblers into Nevada casinos. The shows were canceled, but gambling went on as usual last night. First reports indicate that casino business was only off slightly. Las Vegas entertainment is back in full swing tonight. However, along with all gambling casinos, will be closed during President Kennedy's funeral on Monday. Bill Wood Jr., NBC, Las Vegas.
Again, we repeat that the Kennedy family has decided burial is to be in the Arlington National Cemetery. On Monday, it had been believed earlier that he would be buried at the family plot in Brookline, Massachusetts. Mrs. Jacqueline Kennedy, widow of the late president, made the decision today, burial to be near the site of the Tombs of the Unknown at Arlington National Cemetery, just across the Potomac River from the city of Washington. As Commander-in-Chief of the nation's armed forces, the president has the right to be buried in the National Cemetery. Of course, being a veteran and a war hero as well, he certainly has the right. Burial to follow the Requiem High Mass to be celebrated on Monday, 12 noon, at St. Matthew's Roman Catholic Cathedral in Washington. The British press today highlights the fact that Lee Harvey Oswald, charged with the murder of the president, had links with communism. The conservative Sunday Times said the world waited anxiously to see whether Oswald's background would provoke a wave of right-wing extremist reaction in the United States. The mass circulation news of the world hoped the manner of the president's death, quote, with its inevitable witch-hunting and recrimination, will not be allowed to wreck his work. The sympathy and concern expressed by Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev was seen as unprecedented in the case of the death of a foreign head of state. They have been shocked at the death, as the death of no other Western statesman could shock them, said the Independent Observer. The papers in Britain also focusing on the awesome challenge facing the new president, Lyndon Johnson. The Sunday Times calls him one of the most egocentric men in public life. But as we heard from Dean Braylis in London a short time ago, this is not the view that is shared by the conservative government of British Prime Minister Sir Alec Douglas-Home. We have Ed Newman standing by in our Washington studio. Ed, if you'll come in now.
Russ, I was very interested to hear what the London papers are saying, in particular the fear that one of them expressed that the death of the president might bring about a wave of, what was it called, right-wing repression. That fear has, of course, been expressed here and in a good many other places. So far, at least from what one can see that has been said by the leading politicians in this country, there is no such danger. There is nothing approaching hysteria. There is a good deal of anger, of course, but the anger so far has been directed against the presumptive assassin. I say presumptive because he is accused, he is not convicted. I think the public mood is one of enormous sorrow, as I say, and again one of shock, disbelief, and anger. But I have not yet heard it suggested that this is anything more than an aberration, and that therefore any sort of organization requires to be outlawed, or that dissent as such of any kind should be outlawed. Have you been aware of any such statement by anyone?
No, I have not, Ed. Certainly you know Britain as well as any of us who have been on the air in the last many hours. It seems to me that the language in the Sunday Times is far too strong. Correct me if I'm wrong on this.
It certainly... Excuse me, Russ.
The paper calling him egocentric, openly and without apology, referring to the new president. I think that's a prejudgment. What is your view on that?
Well, my view is, Russ, that Mr. Johnson is a man of great self-confidence. he has never been a shy man, he has never been a retiring man, and he has never been a man with any great doubts about what his function in life was. He is a man who's devoted to public service and who thinks that he has something to offer. The charge that he is, if it is a charge, the comment that he is an egocentric man, I've heard before. But Lyndon Johnson, President Johnson, is a graceful man. There's no false modesty about him. He's fascinated by politics, and he's fascinated, always has been fascinated by the part that he can play in it. I think, on the whole, it is impossible to have arrived at the stage that he has and that other men before him have without having a tremendous amount of self-confidence and a tremendous amount of personal ambition and will. I think that is a better way to put it than to describe him as egocentric. I also think that being President of the United States is a humbling experience rather than an inflating one, and that it is very difficult to remain egocentric if you are egocentric when you are confronted with all the problems that the president is inevitably confronted with.
I think you have touched the heart of the matter right there. Lyndon Johnson, not as a president, but as a politician who was faced with the problem of survival in politics. That is not so much the problem now.
Well, Lyndon Johnson, President Johnson, as we must say, as we must learn to say, is a very competent, I don't like to use the word actor, but I think it's the best word for the moment. He is a man who performs well in public. Now, I don't mean by that he is insincere, but he's a man who understands the requirements of politics. And he is a man who has long felt that he has somewhere to go. He has no doubts about his adequacy to fill the job, and he has conducted himself accordingly. Now, obviously, there came a time when he thought he would probably never get the job, and certainly he never wanted to get it under the conditions in which he has. Rather than saying egocentric, I would say self-confident, I would say dedicated, I would say not tortured by any self-doubts, and I would say a man who sees himself, feels no embarrassment, no reticence about seeing himself in the high office that he now occupies. But I think the Times of London has been distinctly uncharitable.
Edwin, when we talked with Dean Braylis in London a short time ago, he suggested that the thing that, aside from the condolences that the British Prime Minister will bring with him to the family of the late Mr. Kennedy, that the thing most on his mind when he talks with the new President Lyndon Johnson will be the future of the Western Alliance and how Lyndon Johnson will support this end of that alliance on this side of the Atlantic. As you see the situation, do you see anything, any change that would give the British cause for concern?
Well, I do not, Russ, but I think there is this to be said. Mr. Johnson is a new president. Sir Alec Douglas Hume is a new prime minister. Both of them face elections very soon. Sir Alec Douglas Hume faces an election no later than next October. Mr. Johnson faces an election in which we now presume he will be a candidate to succeed himself in November. The Hume election may come before October. It may come in the spring. The alliance is therefore in a very fluid condition so far as the men who are leading it are concerned. There must be a great deal of uncertainty ahead. The Labour Party in England and Britain is not necessarily devoted to all the things that the present Conservative government is, and that is particularly true about nuclear policy, nuclear weapons policy. The British Labour Party might be willing to give up nuclear weapons, or at least not manufacture any more of them, to stop where they are now. And the British Labour Party has the gravest doubts about a project that Sir Alec Douglas Hume endorses and supports, and that was very dear to Mr. Kennedy. That is the project of the so-called mixed man nuclear force, the nuclear force in which servicemen from the countries of the Western Alliance would join and serve together on missile ships. Now, in these circumstances, I think there cannot be the same close cooperation between two men whose positions are much more tentative or temporary than those of the men they succeeded, and who are also distinctly inexperienced in the jobs that they hold, and who do not have the personal standing either at home or abroad that their predecessors did. So I think that the alliance may be in for difficult times. It may be in for some uncertain times. I don't suggest that it's going to crack up, but I think at least during the period immediately ahead, progress is unlikely. I think we have that to worry about.
Edmund, thank you for those interesting comments. I see it's time to remind our listeners they're with the continuous coverage of NBC News on these events surrounding the death of the late president. This is Russ Ward, NBC News, New York.
We'll continue with our nationwide coverage. From our WLW Communications News, Jim Bollinger reporting in relation to the regional news on the assassination of President Kennedy. A 30-day period of state mourning has been declared in Indiana in tribute to the late president. Governor Welsh proclaimed the period today before leaving for the nation's capital with Mrs. Welsh. Welsh called for all state government businesses to come to a halt on Monday. The governor and state school superintendent William Wilson suggested all public and private schools be closed all day Monday. Educators and school administrators promptly complied with the request, and as a result, the vast majority, if not all, of Indiana's educational institutions will be closed. It's being left up to the discretion of the local school superintendents. The University of Cincinnati has suspended all classes for Monday in both its day and evening colleges. Xavier University in Cincinnati will hold classes Monday morning, concluding with a noon mass. There will be no classes in the afternoon at Xavier University. The private, public, and parochial schools in Claremont County in Ohio, the Milford schools, and the public offices will be closed Monday. Our Lady of Cincinnati College will be closed, as will Miami University of Ohio. They will have classes on an abbreviated schedule. Classes on an abbreviated schedule at Miami University. The presidents of the University of Kentucky, Western Kentucky State College, and Georgetown College said tonight that all classes at their respective institutions will be canceled on Monday in observance of the death of President Kennedy. All major downtown stores and those with suburban outlets will be closed until 1 p.m. Monday in Cincinnati, according to the Executive Secretary of the Cincinnati Unlimited, Al Higgins. Governor Bert Combs tonight proclaimed Monday an official day of mourning for the state of Kentucky and urged Kentuckians to assemble in their respective places of worship for memorial services to the late president. Governor Bert Combs will leave Frankfort tomorrow night at 7 p.m. and fly to Washington to attend funeral services. Flying with Combs will be Lieutenant Governor Wilson Wyatt and Governor-elect Edward Breathitt. Kentucky's banking commissioner, H.A. Rogers, said tonight that it was only fitting and proper that every banking and trust company in the state close its doors for sufficient time to give its employees a chance to attend memorial services. Rogers also said that it is within the discretion of every bank to close for the day if it wishes to do so. All post office facilities will be closed Monday. Post office installations will operate on a holiday basis by order of the Postmaster General at Washington, D.C. No deliveries will be made. For the regional weather from our WLW Radar Weather Service, meteorologist Frank Pierce. Frank?
Yes, looking across the area now, clearing skies in much of Indiana. The temperature down to 28 in clear skies at Indianapolis, Indiana, and 30 at Richmond, Ohio. And then that's Richmond, Indiana. And then in Ohio, 33 degrees at Dayton and 36 at Columbus. We're down to 31 here in the city of Cincinnati. And up around Lima, still under cloudy skies with 36. While at Louisville, Kentucky, it's clear and 33 now. Clouds continue at Lexington with a temperature of 32. That cloud band moving slowly eastward, a clearing trend coming into the picture with diminishing winds. The forecast for tonight, we'll find temperatures getting much colder during the night tonight and down into the 20s mostly by tomorrow morning with about 24 in Cincinnati. Sunday will be a brighter, less windy day, but still on the cool side. Look for the highs in the 30s with around 37 in Cincinnati and then a little bit warmer on Sunday night. 31 in Cincinnati, that's the weather.
Wlw-Radio Cincinnati and the Crosley Broadcasting Corporation ask that you join in a prayer for the consolation of the bereaved family of President Kennedy and for the guidance of President Johnson. This is the nation station, WLW Cincinnati. Wlw-Radio in Cincinnati and the Crosley Broadcasting Corporation join our listeners in an expression of deep sorrow on the death of our president. We'll continue our national coverage until 11 o'clock this evening.
We remind you again that funeral services are scheduled for Monday for John F. Kennedy. They will be attended by chiefs of states, both royal and elected, such leaders as French President de Gaulle, German Chancellor Ludwig Erhard, Britain's Prince Philip, Sir Alec Douglas Hume, Russia's Deputy Premier Anastas Mikoyan, Queen Frederica of Greece, King Baudouin of Belgium, and Eamon de Valera of Ireland, among the many to travel to Washington to pay the tribute to the late president. For more on the death of Mr. Kennedy and the feelings of the many Americans who share in this period of grief, we hear from Robert McCormick as he talked with historian Sidney Hyman.
An old friend and a most interesting person, Sidney Hyman, the political historian, author, as you know, of The American President, one of the more fascinating books of recent years, and who, by the way, has 3 books that were put in the White House library by the late President and Mrs. Kennedy, Beckoning Frontiers, and then a book he did with Robert Sherwood, Roosevelt, and Hopkins. And I'd like to ask him some questions that might seem a little abstruse at first, but which actually aren't. Sidney, what happens psychologically to a country after a president dies?
There's been a fairly definite pattern to this, as is you can see when you look back at the history of the 7 preceding presidents who died in office. The first reaction is, of course, one of sympathy for the family of the president. The second reaction is a rallying of the national will to the vice president who does succeed to the presidency. Party divisions, angers, rancors are suddenly forgotten, and you have a sense of transcendent national unity. People rallying, of all factions, rallying around the vice president. But then something disturbing does set in after that, and I hope it won't set in this time. The very fact of the way in which we have chosen vice presidents in the past tends to produce, after the shock of the death of a president, tends to produce a certain psychological disarray in the country. People remember that maybe the vice president was chosen for party purposes in order to console a faction of the party that lost out. People who voted for the president but didn't want to vote for the vice president feel that somehow the man who was now president shouldn't be there. And even when he goes on to win the presidency in his own right, as several of them did, the country has in times past felt that the vice president who is now president is somehow an eccentric act of fate. He shouldn't be there, and what issues from him is not really lawful.
In a sense, they consider him a political freak.
They have, in fact, in times past thought that, yes.
Well, has the death in office of any president actually changed American history, American policies that would influence history?
I think so, and then very specifically, and you've just run through some of the changes that have occurred. In the first case, when William Henry Harrison died in the 1840s and John Tyler succeeded to him to the presidency, it was Tyler's decision to annex Texas, which led to the Mexican War. When Millard Fillmore succeeded President Zachary Taylor, it was Millard Fillmore who approved the Compromise of 1850, which eventually set the stage for the Civil War. When Andrew Johnson succeeded Abraham Lincoln, it was Johnson's inability to get along with the radical Republicans who were in control of the Congress, which set the stage for some of the unhappier aspects of the Reconstruction period in the South. On a more positive side, after Theodore Roosevelt succeeded William McKinley as president, Theodore Roosevelt really became the first of the modern presidents. He brought the presidency into a realm of national life that no preceding president had ever done, and he also brought America into world affairs as no one had ever done. And there can be no question but that the succession of Harry Truman after the death of Franklin Roosevelt could very well have changed the course of history.
Generally, how have our vice presidents measured up as presidents?
This is one of the most remarkable things about the office of the presidency. It's the way the office itself somehow transfigures the man who becomes president, no matter what he has been before. Many of the vice presidents had seemed, on assuming the presidency, to be rather mediocre figures, and yet several of them, at least, certainly Theodore Roosevelt, exceeded in capacity the man who had held the presidency just before them. Even one of the weaker of the vice presidents who succeeded to the presidency, John Tyler, really defended the presidency as an institution at a time when it was coming under bitter attack by the Congress, when some senators, very powerful senators led by Henry Clay, wanted to reduce the presidency almost to a cipher. Tyler successfully defended the presidency as a separate and coordinate branch of the government. I think that even Calvin Coolidge, who succeeded Harding as president, I think was a distinct improvement on Harding. These are part of the mysteries and part of the glory and part of the terror of the presidency itself, what it does to men who get into that office.
That's extremely well put. Of course, we have noticed that here. We've watched vice presidents grow. We have watched presidents grow and mature in their jobs, and it really is amazing what happens to them. The depth of insight they get after just a few months and the degree of judicious perspective they get is most amazing to us. I'd never been able to put it as well as you.
Well, this is, when you pick a president, you really don't know what you're getting until the materials of the place are turned over to him. And the same thing goes for the vice presidency. Harry Truman used to say that there is no future in the presidency. What he meant really was that after a man is president, elected to the presidency, what other higher goal can he aspire for? And that the only motive a man has in being, after he is elected president, is to really, with all the depths of his being, honor the oath he takes as president to uphold, defend, and protect the Constitution to the best of his abilities. And there is this passionate commitment to that. We can have in times past, we can criticize our presidents for being foolish or wise, rash or judicious, and yet we've never had anything in the presidency like the leaders of Europe, the angry men, the destructive men. Our presidents, whether wise or foolish, competent or incompetent, have been, in human terms, good men.
Well, thank you very much, Sidney. You have been listening to Sidney Hyman, the political historian, with some observations about the presidency and what happens to vice presidents who find themselves suddenly thrust into the midst of responsibilities that are simply incomprehensible to the lay citizen in this country.
Our thanks to NBC's Robert McCormick and to historian Sidney Hyman for that report. It might be interesting to many of our listeners to hear how the New York newspapers are handling this story of tragedy on a Sunday morning. The early editions of the Sunday papers are now in our hands. The New York Times, with its full-page headline, "Kennedy's body lies in White House. Johnson at helm with wide backing. Police say prisoner is the assassin." The New York Times goes on to say the body of John Fitzgerald Kennedy lay in repose today in a closed, flag-draped coffin in the East Room of the White House, 2 priests kneeling in silent prayer, and a military guard of honor keeping constant watch. From the Herald Tribune, the banner headline, "The Kennedy Choice, the Nation's Future," showing a photograph of the late president, his vice president, now the president of the United States, and Attorney General Robert Kennedy. And the caption, "At the quiet times as well as the great moments, in the individual faces as well as in the gathered crowds, men and events collide to create the past and change the future." In a hotel room 3 years ago, the vibrant young senator, who had just capped a long fight by winning the Democratic presidential nomination, persuaded his chief rival, the powerful leader of the Senate, to take the second spot on his ticket. Senator Kennedy decided. Robert Kennedy, his mainstay, Senator Johnson, listened and agreed. That from the Sunday Herald Tribune here in New York, "The Kennedy Choice, the Nation's Future." The future president, of course, Lyndon B. Johnson.
Tomorrow night, Sunday, starting at 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, NBC Radio will present a special memorial program entitled The Highest Price, a 4-hour documentary of the life and times of our late president, John Fitzgerald Kennedy, and an evaluation of the impact on history of his life and death. The Highest Price, tomorrow night, Sunday at 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time on the NBC Radio Network.
Throughout the Sunday papers here in New York, tributes to John Fitzgerald Kennedy, such ads as, "We join the nation in mourning the passing of our beloved president, John Fitzgerald Kennedy, 1917 to 1963. That ad is larger than one of the city stores. Another fashionable Fifth Avenue store with its large ad in the Sunday paper, "Saks Fifth Avenue joins the world in mourning the loss of our late president." In memoriam, in profound tributes, in memoriam, in this time of national mourning, the Sunday papers here in New York City crowded with tributes instead of the regular advertising. "We deeply mourn the death of our president," reads one. This store family expresses deepest and most profound sympathy in the passing of the President of the United States. Throughout the city, throughout the nation and the world as well, all sharing this hour of grief for the late President, John F. Kennedy, to be buried Monday at 12 noon in Arlington National Cemetery in Washington. During the events of the day, White House News Secretary Pierre Salinger told newsmen that in his first session with his cabinet, the new chief executive, Lyndon Johnson, asked all members of the cabinet to stay on the job. As Salinger said, Johnson told the 10 men he needed their help in the time ahead. Yet it's a matter of historical fact that vice presidents taking office as presidents have in due course made substantial changes in the cabinet membership. Similarly, Johnson has asked the nation's ambassadors around the world not to submit the pro forma resignations that customarily follow a change in the presidency. Johnson has said nothing as yet about the heads of the large executive agencies and other top posts over which he holds control, but it is to be presumed that there will be no general house cleaning such as usually follows a shift of power from one party to another. The cabinet is particularly the special and more or less private instrument of a president. The members must not only subscribe to the basic administrative policies, but must be able to function in harmony with the chief executive if they are to be effective. Certainly it is too early for Johnson to have applied any such practical tests to his relations as chief executive with the men who make up his cabinet. But as we said a moment ago, Pierre Salinger, the White House news secretary, has told newsmen that in his first session with the cabinet today, the new president has asked all the members to stay on the job. Tomorrow afternoon at 3 o'clock, President Johnson is scheduled to meet with the ambassador to South Vietnam, Henry Cabot Lodge, concerning that fight against communist guerrillas and presumably on the anti-communist campaign in Southeast Asia generally. That meeting with Lodge, just one more of the many sessions the President has held today, will hold tomorrow, and for the next many days. I wonder if Ed Newman is with us in our Washington studios now.
I am, Russ. I was thinking about what we were talking about before, the comment of the Times of London tomorrow, the Sunday Times of London, which is, of course, already on the streets, that Mr. Johnson was one of the most egocentric men in public life, and you remember we discussed that and thought it was somewhat overstated. I thought as I reflected on it that perhaps the great difference between Mr. Kennedy and Mr. Johnson in that respect is that Mr. Johnson appears to lack the sense of humor about himself as a politician that Mr. Kennedy had, and I have put that point to a really old hand here in Washington who knows far more about it than I do, Robert McCormick. Is that true?
Well, I'd never thought of it actually in those terms, but I think you probably are right now that you bring it up. Of course, the thing that most of us have noticed in Johnson since he became Senate leader, which goes back a good ways, is his perfectly fantastic temper. He's liable to explode like an A-bomb without any warning at all, and when he does, well, we might just as well know the sort of man we have in the White House, sort of man he's been at least. He can be downright rude. I've been at news conferences when female reporters in the back of the room have said very quietly and politely, please, Mr. Johnson, could you speak a little louder? And he said, no, I won't speak any louder. If you can't hear me, you'll have to get a fill-in from somebody else. Well, that obviously is something that happens under stress, but at the same time, his temper is almost legendary. He is not deliberately unpleasant. As a matter of fact, when you're with him in a living room or in any sort of a social gathering, he's a garrulous person. He loves to talk and tell stories. He's extremely amusing and awfully well informed. He's, I don't know whether he has quite the almost photographic memory that the late President Kennedy had for figures and facts, but he's simply stuffed with information about anything he attempts to go into. If he doesn't know, this, mind you, is all past experience, if he doesn't know anything about a subject, he doesn't attempt to declare himself on it. In other words, he wants to know the facts before he, as we say in the colloquial, shoots off his mouth, and he's never, to my knowledge at least, varied from that, which is one reason he was so successful as a Senate leader, because whether he was being rough with other senators or whether he was being friendly with a well-known gesture of putting his arm around the recalcitrant's shoulder, he backed up his arguments always with positive and solid information.
Bob, you mentioned Mr. Johnson's temper. You said he had a tremendous and legendary temper. So, of course, does Mr. Eisenhower. Is that not so?
Oh, absolutely. President Eisenhower's temper was one that was better concealed, I think. I don't mean to imply he had better control of it. Perhaps it was just that he never really let go with it where it might damage not his own image, but damage the job he held. And he had that much control of it. But people who have worked with President Eisenhower very closely, of course, have been sort of terrified sometimes by his temper.
Well, the people who work with Mr. Johnson, who have worked with Mr. Johnson, in spite of his temper, have been very devoted to him and very, very happy to work with him, have they not, and for him?
He works his staff very, very hard. I don't think there's a harder taskmaster in Washington. But those of his staff that I've had the pleasure and privilege of knowing are completely devoted to him, and the turnover in his staff has been very small. He has people who have been with him and around him for many, many years, and they are just, I guess devoted is the only word. They admire him a great deal. They will hear nothing bad about him. They are quite aware of his temper and other sort of little personal foibles that heaven knows we all have. But those things apparently are completely counterbalanced by qualities in the man that aren't quite so obvious as a display of temper which is triggered by something just at the moment. But he is, I go back again, he's an extremely charming person to be around. And when he comes to a party and decides to talk, he's just bewitching. He thinks in colorful terms. He has a very penetrating mind. He can sort of go to the, particularly in politics, he can go to the point of anything with great decision and forthrightness.
Robert, allow me to interrupt for just a moment and refer back to this announcement by Pierre Salinger that Lyndon Johnson wants the former president's cabinet to stay on the job. Would you care to comment on how that might be translated in terms of the future of the president's brother, the Attorney General?
The question, Bob, is since President Johnson has asked the cabinet to remain on the job, what is likely to be the future of Robert Kennedy, the Attorney General?
Well, obviously, I don't think any of us has any information. My own guess would be that the Attorney General will himself want to get out, quite without regard to what the President might want him to do, because he probably will feel that he just wouldn't fit in, and I don't know, it just seems to me that psychologically he would want to get out and sort of strike off on his own, but that's just a wild guess. Maybe the President, if he wants him enough to remain, will be able to persuade him to do so.
I have seen tonight, Russ, the first suggestion that Robert Kennedy might go on a ticket with Mr. Johnson as the vice presidential candidate in 1964. Now, obviously, there's nothing more behind this than the merest sort of speculation on the part of the man who wrote the article. But it is something we might conceivably hear more about in the future.
If we judge by standard politics, perhaps a more logical selection would be Hubert Humphrey, the Senate Democratic whip, because, again, assessing the political situation by the traditional standards, Lyndon Johnson will have a great appeal in rural areas and more appeal in the South than the late President Kennedy would have had. But he will have two weak points, one in the industrial areas of the East and the other in the so-called mountain states out through the near West, if we can call it that, Montana and Idaho and Wyoming, and Minnesota. And in those areas, of course, Humphrey would be extremely strong, presumably, again, judging by traditional political standards.
Robert,
where the Attorney General's political power would be is a little bit hard to tell.
I believe it was in your discussion earlier with Senator Humphrey, Robert, that it was mentioned that the present cabinet is not at all strangers to Lyndon Johnson, that he has been in on cabinet sessions, and that he knows them and they know him.
Well, yes, I don't think Bob McCormick heard the question because he is in a part of the studio where he can't, but the question was, is it not true that Vice President Johnson knows the present cabinet, and does not the present cabinet know him? The answer, of course, is yes, they know each other very well. I will yield to Bob in a moment. I just want to say that I don't think that if the cabinet does undergo any changes, even if it underwent changes tomorrow, that we should attach any extraordinary importance to it. I think presidents have to choose their own cabinets. It's extremely important to them that they do, and it's essential to them that they do. And if there are to be cabinet changes that the president desires, they can only be because he would expect to work more comfortably and effectively with those he has chosen. So I don't think there is any ground for dismay or shock if any of the present cabinet members go, always assuming that they are replaced by people at least as competent. Would you agree with that, Bob?
Yes, completely. You took the words right out of my mouth. Actually, the cabinet members and all of the members of the president's official family have to make decisions on their own. Obviously, the president can't review all of them. So the president has to have people around him with whom he has an empathy, a sort of mutuality of spirituality. He has to be able to delegate authority to them and know that their instincts will be about the same as his. And the fact that a man would not react the same way a new president would doesn't mean that they are not able and perfectly conscientious and everything else desirable. It just simply means that they wouldn't really work in quite the same team spirit with the president that another man might.
We've talked a good deal, Russ, about the appeal that President Johnson may have in the South that President Kennedy presumably would not have had he been running again in 1964. I wonder whether, if Mr. Johnson embraces the entire civil rights policy of Mr. Kennedy, he will perhaps be regarded in the South as something of a renegade and arouse a kind of opposition that perhaps Mr. Kennedy would not have aroused. Now, does that seem possible to you, Russ, and to you, Bob?
It seems to me that the vice president has, well, we can't use the phrase gone out of his way, but he has given the president's civil rights program probably far greater support than many people thought he would. This is not to suggest any ulterior motive on his part, but I don't know of anyone in Washington who has been more outspoken on behalf of the president's civil rights program than Lyndon Johnson, unless perhaps it was Senator Hubert Humphrey. Perhaps Bob has more to say on that subject.
Surely the amount of support that Mr. Johnson would get from the South, or will get from the South if he runs in 1964, will depend to a very considerable extent on who is running against him. And there are Republican candidates one can think of who would bring to Mr. Johnson a great deal of support in the South, and there may be one or two others who would take a good deal of Southern support away from him. Is that not so?
Well, yes, I think it is, but also Johnson, in spite of, as Russ Ward points out, his forthright statements on civil rights, was not regarded with the same animosity in the South that the late President Kennedy was. And I think part of it is due to the fact that Johnson, being by his background being Southern, the South feels that if he speaks words that they don't approve of, at least he speaks them with a full knowledge and understanding of the Southern viewpoint, which they never gave the late President Kennedy credit for. They thought he spoke as a Northerner and as a representative of the industrial areas of the East and the North. But on the other hand, they, if only because of his accent, they regard President Johnson as being at least more understanding of their problems.
Gentlemen, Gentlemen, we just have about 45 seconds before a station break. May I ask you briefly how long it will be before the city of Washington, the official city of Washington, returns to normal following the tragedy of yesterday?
Well, unfortunately, Russ, as you well know, it has to return to normal, and by the end of next week, it simply must be back at business, harsh as it may sound at this time to say such a thing.
You're listening to NBC's continuous coverage of the events surrounding the death of the late President of the United States, John Fitzgerald Kennedy.
A brief recap here of a development from Dallas, which we have not mentioned in some time, and for the benefit of those who may have joined us in the last few minutes, Dallas Police Chief Jesse Curry says photographs found in the home of Lee Harvey Oswald, Oswald's Russian-born wife, link Oswald with the rifle that was used in the assassination of President Kennedy. Curry says the pictures found in the home in Dallas, Texas, in the suburb of Irving, will be used as evidence in Oswald's murder trial. Oswald has been charged with murdering the president, with killing a Dallas policeman, and the latest charge against him with attempting to kill Texas Governor John Connally. We must add that Oswald has denied any connection with any of the crimes with which he is charged. Chief Curry says the last charge, the assault with intent to murder the governor, was filed this afternoon, and Curry adds, "We had this case in good shape this morning. It is even stronger tonight." Unnamed officials of the Communist Party in the United States say Oswald has no connection with their party. The Dallas Police Chief, Jesse Curry, says Oswald has readily admitted that he is a communist. The members of the U.S. Communist Party say they had nothing to do with what they call this monstrous crime. It's been a day of mourning in the nation's capital. Lyndon Johnson putting in his first full day as the new President of the United States, and with Edwin Newman and Robert McCormick standing by in our Washington newsroom, perhaps you could give us a brief summary of the events coming up in the next couple of days. We will be going back to our Washington newsroom momentarily. Tomorrow, the new president, Lyndon Johnson, has arranged a meeting with the ambassador to South Vietnam, Henry Cabot Lodge. On Wednesday of next week, President Johnson will address a combined session of the Senate and House. At that time, the broad outlines of the course of the new chief executive may become apparent. Johnson has already given solemn and has plunged swiftly into the task of rallying the nation and the government in this solemn moment. The new president has conferred today with former Presidents Eisenhower and Truman, with the entire Kennedy cabinet, and with Secretary of State Rusk and Defense Secretary McNamara. A high administration leader has said of Johnson's forthcoming address on Wednesday, "I do not expect it to be a program speech or a partisan speech." The new president has asked all members of the cabinet of the late President Kennedy to stay on the job during this trying period. President Johnson has stressed that the Kennedy administration foreign policy will be continued. In his first formal address to the people, the president set aside Monday as a day of mourning for the assassination of Mr. Kennedy. Controller James Saxon has given his approval to the closing of banks on Monday. There will be no postal deliveries on that date. Post offices generally will be closed. Thousands of business offices across the country will be empty as the nation joins in this National Day of Mourning. In keeping with the tone of this day in history, rain fell steadily in Washington. Here in New York, a rain that seemed to add to the emotional gloom that people everywhere are feeling. Tomorrow, a horse-drawn caisson, accompanied by ceremonial troops from all the armed services, will carry the body of John Kennedy to the Capitol Rotunda. This tomorrow at 1 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. The White House says the body of the assassinated president will be borne on a flag-draped caisson. It'll be drawn by 7 horses and preceded by Capitol and military escorts from the White House to the Capitol building. This is Russ Ward, NBC News, New York.
As you know, the NBC radio network has canceled all regularly scheduled programs to bring you this continuous coverage of the events surrounding the death of the late President of the United States, John F. Kennedy. We will remain on the air with this continuous coverage until 11 p.m. Eastern Standard Time tonight. We will begin our continuous coverage on Sunday morning at 8 a.m. Eastern Standard Time and on Monday morning at 7 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. And now we pause for station identification.
This is the Nation Station, WLW in Cincinnati.
Among the national leaders who have taken note of this day of tragedy is the Prime Minister of Cuba, Fidel Castro. And for that story, we hear from NBC's John Wlw-Radio in Miami.
Cuban Premier Fidel Castro is now speaking to the Cuban people over nationwide radio and television. Castro, who was an hour late, which is not unusual for him, opened his remarks by saying that when something of transcendental national importance has happened, it has been his custom to speak to the Cuban people, to give his opinion, and to let the people know what attitude to adopt in such situations. With this in mind, he continued, the acts culminating in the assassination of the President of the United States, plus the role that the United States plays in international politics, are facts on which the Cubans must make an objective analysis of the possible consequences to Cuba. Castro went on to say that the Kennedy administration, as the Eisenhower administration before, was characterized by hostile and implacable policies toward Cuba. He said Cuba was the victim of continuing attacks that cost blood, and he added that hundreds of Cubans have lost their lives defending the country against what he calls the imperialist Yankee. He accused the Kennedy administration of having carried the world to the brink of nuclear war. Nevertheless, Castro said, the news of the assassination of the president is grave and bad, and he said all human beings repudiate the act of assassination. He said the circumstances which surround the assassination of the president have no justification. Castro went on in saying that the reactionaries, and that's his word, are taking advantage of the assassination to launch a state of anti-Soviet and anti-Cuba hysteria in the United States. There, he said, there is a strong current of reactionaries and racists and economic factors that affect U.S. policy. He continued that the association could only benefit the reactionary sectors of the United States, among which President Kennedy could not be counted. He also charged that these reactionary elements sought to push President Kennedy toward war. Castro's broadcast, and he is still speaking, by the way, was the first official Cuban reaction to the president's death. This is John Wlw-Radio, NBC News in Miami.
From abroad, sorrowing West Berliners burned 1 million candles tonight in memory of the man they regard as a very close and dear friend, John F. Kennedy. City lights were dimmed in nearly every window throughout the sprawling metropolis that flickered from the 1 million candles. From Dallas, Texas, Governor John Connally showed great improvement today. The 46-year-old governor was seriously wounded by the assassin who killed the president yesterday. The possibility arose that Connally may have been an equally deliberate target along with the late president. Connally is lucid and has talked with members of his staff and with Mrs. Connally. Connally's attending physician says the bullet apparently struck Connally in the back, went through his chest, into his wrist, and then embedded in his thigh. A late medical bulletin reported Connally's color, pulse, and blood pressure this evening is good. The governor's doctor says he should recover completely and should have no permanent disability. There was mourning in all parts of the nation today over the death of the president. Many sporting events were canceled in this period of tragedy. The National Football League's decision to go through with 7 games on its schedule tomorrow evoked indignant reactions from many pro-football fans. On the other hand, several clubs, including the New York Giants, who will play the St. Louis Cardinals at Yankee Stadium tomorrow, reported increased demand for tickets, long sold out in the case of the Giants because of the weekend's television and radio shutdown on sports. We might add that lay leaders of the Abyssinian Baptist Church here in New York are urging a boycott of the NFL game between the Giants and the Cardinals in Yankee Stadium. For a wrap-up now of developments today and in the days ahead in Washington, we hear from NBC's Robert McCormick and Edwin Newman.
Russ, the tone of this day was set by the fact that President Kennedy's rocking chair was removed from the White House. Not only his rocking chair, the sailfish he caught off Acapulco, Mexico in 1953, and the head of a deer that he shot on Mr. Johnson's own ranch in Texas. This day began, really, with the remains of Mr. Kennedy being brought to the White House, where from 10 to 11 this morning, the family and close friends went in. Mrs. Kennedy went in. The Kennedy children went in. The coffin, of course, was closed, had been closed, in Dallas. And after that, government officials went in. President Johnson and Mrs. Johnson and President Johnson and Mrs. Johnson went to see Mrs. Kennedy. President Eisenhower, President Truman were among those who went through. Chief Justice and Mrs. Warren. But President Kennedy has been with us today only as a departed spirit. The president now is Lyndon Johnson. And Lyndon Johnson put in a 12-hour and 20-minute day in his first full day as President of the United States. He reported for work in the Executive Office building across from the White House, across the street from the White House at 8:55 this morning. He completed his day's work at 9:15 tonight. It is worthy of note that when he came in the morning, Representative Homer Thornberry, a Texas Democrat who was nominated by President Kennedy to be a federal judge, Representative Thornberry was with him. And when he left tonight, at the end of his 12-and-a-half-hour day to go home, Representative Thornberry was with him again. During the day, Mr. Johnson had meetings with Secretary of State Rusk, with Secretary of State McNamara. He had a cabinet meeting. He issued a proclamation designating Monday as a day of mourning for the nation. And he read the proclamation for radio and television. And he had conferences with former President Eisenhower, with former President Truman. He attended special services that he had requested, and he attended them with Mrs. Johnson at his side at the church known as the Church of the Presidents, St. John's Episcopal Church, which is on the square, Lafayette Square, across from the White House. While all this was going on, of course, rain was falling. It never ceased to fall almost throughout the day. And the changes went on at the White House as the new president took over. All the time in the East Room of the White House, the catafalque bearing the casket lit by candles of President Kennedy lay in the East Room. And it was passed by Republicans, by Democrats, by independents, by people of no political persuasion, saying, many of them, their last goodbye to President Kennedy. Mr. Johnson's last visitor today was the Secretary of Labor, Willard Wirtz. That meeting lasted an hour and 45 minutes. The reason, presumably, is that on Tuesday, a 7-member arbitration board is scheduled to make its report in the dispute between the railways and the operating unions, the dispute that arises from the desire of the railway management to dismiss a number of workers and change the working rules and the resistance to that by the unions. Wirtz said he thought the report would be filed on Tuesday, and it is, of course, to be filed to President Kennedy. At this moment, President Johnson is at his home. He is not at the White House. He and his family have not moved into the White House. And as the presidential car approached the Johnsons' home tonight, Secret Service men and police on duty there swung open the iron gates, and the car sped in without stopping. As soon as the car entered the driveway, the gates were closed. Something else President Johnson did today was schedule a speech to a joint session of Congress on Wednesday. And that speech, we're told, will not be a partisan or legislative speech in any way. It will be a plea for national unity. On Tuesday, Mr. Johnson has arranged to spend most of the day working, reviewing papers on policy, and conferring with some of the more important men who will be in Washington for the funeral on Monday. They include President de Gaulle, Prime Minister Sir Alec Douglas Hume of Great Britain, Chancellor Ludwig Erhard of West Germany, and a number of others. The mid-afternoon cabinet session today was begun with a minute of silent prayer for the late President Kennedy. Tomorrow also, Mr. Johnson is to have his daily, it is now a daily thing for him, the intelligence briefing covering the world situation at about 10. At about 11, they're out of his services at St. Mark's Episcopal Church, which he and Mrs. Johnson will attend. After that, they will return to the White House and join the cortege to carry the body of Mr. Kennedy to the Capitol, where it will lie in state until Monday morning. And finally, the Kennedy family decided today that Mr. Kennedy should be buried in Arlington National Cemetery, where many of America's heroes lie, across the Potomac from Washington. Now I'm asking Robert McCormick of the NBC Washington staff to give us his impression of this day in Washington.
Well, we had a tragically paradoxical situation today where in the east wing of the White House, of course, there was deep mourning and intense distress where the president's body lay in repose. At the west end of the White House, President Johnson was trying as hard as ever he could to keep the government moving and to maintain a continuity of government, which is extremely difficult under any circumstances. Under these, it is just impressively hard to do, particularly since we had people like Senate Democratic leader Mansfield and his assistant, Senator Humphrey of Minnesota, so overwhelmed with grief that they really had, by their own confession, lost much of their efficiency and really couldn't operate as well as they should have. But in attempting to keep things going on a smooth, even keel, the president took certain very definite steps. He notified the diplomatic missions here that they were not to, as usual, submit their resignations, but to stay here and keep going, just as they had been before. He also notified his cabinet, at least indirectly, that he wanted them to stay on for the time being, at least, and the speech he scheduled for Wednesday before a joint session of Congress is further evidence of his attempt to keep things moving as smoothly as it's possible to do. And also we found out that the president, and you may have heard, has scheduled a high-level conference tomorrow with Henry Cabot Lodge, our ambassador to Saigon, to discuss the war in South Vietnam. In other words, President Johnson is just doing everything he possibly can to have no hiatus in the business of government. And today, in another action, he, again along the same lines, he had separate meetings with Secretary of State Rusk and with Defense Secretary McNamara, and from this it became clear that the President himself has made it clear that his prime objective at this moment is to continue without any change whatever the foreign policy of President Kennedy. And this word, no doubt, now is spreading to the countries that would be most affected by it, and is quietly circulating around the world. It's a most difficult chore indeed for President Johnson because he is as stricken as any of the rest of us, it goes without saying. But he must buckle down to work, and he must keep things moving. And he must, more is the pity, make other people work who are not in any way inclined to at this point, because they are completely overwhelmed. I think that just about covers it from here. Russ?
Thank you, gentlemen, and Robert McCormick and Edmund Newman in our Washington newsroom. The other important developing center of this story is Dallas, Texas, where the assassination took place about 34 hours ago. Dallas police are saying they believe they have cinched their case against the assassin of the late President Kennedy. For more on the Dallas story, we go to Tom Perryman.
Russ, the latest developments in Dallas includes these points. Accused assassin Oswald remains adamant, denying any knowledge of the assassination of John Kennedy. A paraffin test taken to determine if Oswald had fired a weapon appears positive, says police. Police say they have a photo of Oswald aiming a rifle with a telescopic sight made at his home in Irving, near Dallas. Oswald was seeking this evening the services of lawyer John Apt of New York City. The accused assassin will be transferred to the county jail from the city jail tomorrow morning at 10. A fund has been started for the widow and 3 children of the late patrolman J.D. Tippett. A Victoria industrial worker started the fund for the widow and 3 children today, and Charles D. Griffith is identified as the man from Victoria down in South Texas. And we talked with police headquarters. The chief had already gone home this evening when we were checking on this matter, but money has received at the Dallas Police Department in hopes of providing adequate income for the widow of the late J.D. Tippett. We understand she will not be eligible for a pension, and money has been arriving at the Dallas Police Chief's office. That's the latest developments from Dallas.
Tom, while you're on the line, let me ask you if a date has been set for the indictment of Oswald. Do you have any information on that?
Not on the date of an indictment. We believe he will be indicted next week. We don't know exactly when.
Mm-hmm. I think it's most significant, the story that you just mentioned regarding the photographs. That development in the case, we presume to be the censure, as was referred to earlier in the day.
Right.
Tom, thank you very much for your help throughout the day, and certainly for your help in days to come.
It's been my pleasure.
Virtually all stores, all banks, schools, libraries, theaters in the country to be closed on Monday for the National Day of Mourning for President Kennedy. Many industrial firms will observe a minute of silence at 11 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. Others will give employees time to attend funeral, memorial services, or community services on that date. The Baltimore and Ohio Railroad will stop all of its trains for 1 minute during the president's funeral. All security and commodity markets, including the New York Stock Exchange, will be closed on that date. The major department stores in New York, in Chicago, Kansas City, Pittsburgh, Columbus, Ohio, Portland, Oregon, San Francisco, and Sacramento will be closed all day Monday. In scores of cities, including Houston, Texas, and Milwaukee, Wisconsin, all stores will be closed in the morning or during the hours of the funeral. The North Carolina Merchants Association has asked the state's 90,000 retail firms to close for an hour beginning at noon Eastern Standard Time. All plants in Kansas City connected with the women's garment industry will be closed all day on Monday, a day of national mourning. The Wisconsin Supreme Court has postponed the morning cases on its Monday calendar. The Bank of America ordered all its branches in California to close for an hour at midday. Tampa, Florida banks will be closed for 2 hours. Kansas State University canceled all Monday classes and scheduled a memorial service in the University Field House. All Pittsburgh colleges and its university will be closed for the day, and all will sponsor memorial services. The National General Corporation ordered its 220 movie theaters in 16 western and midwestern states closed until 6 p.m. Eastern Standard Time on Monday. The Metropolitan Opera called off its evening performance. The League of New York Theaters was considering canceling Monday performances at Broadway theaters. 25 major department stores in Philadelphia and suburbs affiliated with the Philadelphia Merchants Association will be closed on Monday. The Post Office Department has announced that all postal installations will be closed Monday, but some limited service will be provided for businesses. The Comptroller of the Currency and the Regulator of National Banks said it strongly approves of actions by individual banks or of governors of states to close banks Monday and urges the adoption of similar action by other states and banks. The Comptroller's announcement appeared to mean that banks were free to close and that the Comptroller hoped they would. From Miami, Premier Fidel Castro has expressed doubt tonight that Lee Oswald, the accused slayer of President Kennedy, was a leader of the Fair Play for Cuba Committee of the United States. Castro's Havana speech, monitored in Miami, carried the remark that his regime had no connection with the president's death. He charged that the, quote, most reactionary elements in the United States are trying to link him with Oswald and with the assassination. Making a Havana television appearance, Castro angrily read news dispatches from Dallas about Oswald and said the news agency was working to defame both the Soviet Union and his own country. It's been announced from Seoul, Korea, that South Korean President Chung-hee Park will fly to Washington later today to attend the funeral of President Kennedy. He's expected to travel on a U.S. Air Force plane. Also on Monday, President Charles de Gaulle of France will be in attendance at the funeral. The new Prime Minister of Britain, Sir Alec Douglas-Home, and Prince Philip, representing Queen Elizabeth, King Baudouin of Belgium, Chancellor Ludwig Erhard of West Germany, and Mayor Willy Brandt of the divided city of Berlin, Foreign Minister Masayoshi Ohira of Japan, and the first Deputy Chairman of the Council of Ministers of the USSR, Anastas Mikoyan. There was a sudden and somewhat confused security setup in effect at the LBJ Ranch near Johnson City, Texas, the ranch of the new President Johnson. Secret Service men at the ranch yesterday preparing for an expected visit when word came of the assassination. Of course, that visit to the ranch was never held. A brief late news development now as we return to our NBC News studio in Washington.
The news development, Russ, is the weather forecast for Washington tomorrow, which is sunny and colder with the highest in the upper 40s. So that after today's dismal, heavy rain and gray day, tomorrow, at any rate, will be clear. It will be cold, but it will be clear. And in a way, that is a blessing.
Edwin, we thank you once again for that report. And we remind our listeners that we will continue tomorrow with the coverage of the events surrounding this tragic weekend. This is Russ Ward, NBC News, New York.
This concludes, for this evening, our continuous coverage of the events surrounding the death of the late President of the United States, John F. Kennedy. However, we shall return at 11 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, following a 70-second station break, that's about 2 minutes from now, with a full 5-minute newscast. We shall also have 5 minutes of news at 12 midnight, 1 a.m. and 2 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, for those stations that normally carry those newscasts. We shall resume with our continuous coverage at 8 a.m. Eastern Standard Time Sunday and at 7 a.m. Eastern Standard Time on Monday. Tomorrow night, Sunday, starting at 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, NBC Radio will present a special memorial program entitled The Highest Price, a 4-hour documentary of the life and times of our late President John Fitzgerald Kennedy, and an evaluation of the impact on history of his life and death. The Highest Price, tomorrow night, Sunday at 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. This is the NBC Radio Network.
This is the nation station, WLW in Cincinnati. Following the national and international news from NBC, we'll have a direct report on the regional weather from our WLW radar weather service. WLW-Radio in Cincinnati and the Crosley Broadcasting Corporation ask that you join in a prayer for the consolation of the bereaved family of President Kennedy and for the guidance of President Johnson. We wish to announce that the University of Cincinnati has suspended all classes for Monday in both its day and evening colleges. Xavier University in Cincinnati will hold classes Monday morning with a Mass to be celebrated at noon, and classes will resume in the afternoon. Miami University will have classes on an abbreviated schedule. Our Lady of Cincinnati College has canceled classes for Monday. The presidents of the University of Kentucky, Western Kentucky State College, and Georgetown College said that all classes will be canceled on Monday.
This is NBC Radio, News on the Hour. Now here is Russ Ward, NBC News.
Cuban Premier Fidel Castro expressed doubt tonight that Lee Oswald, accused slayer of President Kennedy, is a leader of the Fair Play for Cuba Committee in the United States. Castro also said his regime had no connection with the president's death. He charged that the, quote, most reactionary elements in the United States are trying to link Cuba with Oswald and with the assassination. In Dallas, Texas, police say they have an airtight case against Oswald. Dallas Police Chief Jesse Curry says he has old photographs that show Oswald carrying an Italian-made rifle similar to that used to kill the president. The pictures were found in Irving, Texas, the residence of Oswald's Russian-born wife. Police and FBI agents have a letter Oswald used to order a bolt-action rifle from a Chicago mail-order house. Earlier, police announced that tests of Oswald's hands proved he had recently fired a weapon. Oswald still says he is innocent and has confessed to nothing. Later today, police formally accused Oswald of attempted murder in the wounding of Texas Governor John Connally, who remains in satisfactory condition in a Dallas hospital. Oswald also is charged with the murder of a Dallas policeman, J.D. Tippett. Meanwhile, in Washington, mourning for the president continues. Mr. Kennedy's body in a flag-draped casket lay in state in the East Room of the White House. A private family mass was said there this morning, and then led by President Lyndon Johnson. The members of the government, state governors, and foreign diplomats came to pay their last respects. President Kennedy will be buried with full military honors in Arlington National Cemetery on Monday after a pontifical requiem mass at noon in St. Matthew's Cathedral. A longtime friend of the Kennedy family, Richard Cardinal Cushing of Boston, will officiate. Tomorrow, the president's body will be borne down Pennsylvania Avenue to the rotunda of the Capitol, where it will lie in state until Monday morning. Mrs. Kennedy will ride in a limousine behind the caisson bearing the body of her 46-year-old husband. When the cortege arrives at the Capitol, a battery will fire the traditional 21-gun salute, and the band will play the ruffles and flourishes, followed by the President's March, Hail to the Chief. While at the rotunda, the public will be allowed to view the casket. It will rest on the catafalque used when President Lincoln lay in state almost 100 years ago. At 11 o'clock on Monday, the president's body will be moved to the cathedral for the Requiem Mass, and then on to Arlington for burial. As the morning went on in Washington and around the world today, President Johnson took up the reins of government. In one of his first official acts, he proclaimed Monday as a day of national mourning for Mr. Kennedy, whom he called a great and good man. Earlier in the day, President Johnson held a cabinet meeting in which he asked for and got assurances that all 10 members will continue in their positions. Operating from his old suite in the Executive Office Building, President Johnson also held conferences with key members of the former president's administration, including CIA Director John McCone and McGeorge Bundy, presidential advisor on national security affairs. Former Presidents Eisenhower and Truman also called on Mr. Johnson. President Johnson will address a joint session of Congress next Wednesday. Meanwhile, leaders of Congress indicated they will give President Johnson a breathing spell so he can clarify his plans and programs. Senate Majority Leader Mike Mansfield of Montana says the Senate will meet briefly Monday, just long enough to pass a resolution of sympathy over the death of the president. Speaker John McCormick said the House will resume its work briefly on Wednesday to act on urgent money legislation and then will adjourn on Friday. Lady Bird Johnson assumed her role as the First Lady with a quiet dignity. She met with congressional leaders briefly while her husband was in conference with administration officials. Later, Mrs. Kennedy offered Mrs. Johnson all possible help to make the changeover a smooth one. Leaders of foreign governments and their peoples are joining Americans to mourn President Kennedy. In Western Europe, many countries honored the late president with traditions reserved only for the deaths of their own leaders. In England, Queen Elizabeth ordered a week of mourning. French President Charles de Gaulle, preparing to fly here tomorrow for the funeral, ordered the tricolor flown at half-mast. All over West Berlin tonight, candles flicker in thousands of windows in a final tribute to the president. This is Russ Ward, NBC News, New York.
This has been NBC Radio News on the Hour. Listen again on the hour for NBC News. This is the NBC Radio Network.
This is the nation station, WLW in Cincinnati. For the weather from our WLW radar weather service, meteorologist Frank Pierce. Frank?
Good evening, everyone. Well, cold air seems to be well entrenched in our area and spreading eastward to the eastern seaboard now. With the cool air having arrived in Washington, D.C., the temperature down to 56 degrees. The rains have passed east of there. There'll be some breaking out of the cloudiness there. And during the day tomorrow, a good bit of clearing. Looks like that area will then be on the fair weather side, though cool during Sunday, and then continuing on the sunny side into Monday, when the temperatures are expected to be just a little bit warmer. And during the ceremonies there, temperatures should get into the upper 40s or low 50s. There may be just a little bit of the windy condition over on that side of the Appalachian Mountains. Back here on our particular Ohio, Indiana, and Kentucky areas, the skies are largely clear now throughout Indiana and the western half of Kentucky, and the retreating band of cloud continues to press on slowly eastward and will do so the rest of the night. Now, it's liable to give just a few flurries of snow in the eastern counties of Ohio during the night tonight, but that, of course, of no consequence, and, of course, no accumulations, and it will pass out into the mountain sections during the night. Before we go into the forecast further, a look at temperatures around the area now. Cincinnati, 31 degrees under cloudy skies. It's 32 at Dayton and 34 at Columbus, still cloudy at both stations, and up around Lima, 31 and cloudy. 36 at Portsmouth, Ohio, 31 at both Louisville and Lexington, both reporting clear skies. It's also clear at Indianapolis, Indiana, with 27, one of the cooler spots right now in our three-state area. Also 28 degrees at Richmond and Muncie. The WLW weather forecast for the cool air to hold here over the rest of the weekend. We'll see diminishing winds through the area, clearing skies tonight, and, of course, with that colder weather coming into the picture, early morning lows should be generally in the 20s, with around 24 expected here in the Queen City. Again, a chance of those flurries tonight in the easternmost counties of Ohio and into the foothills of the Appalachian Mountains. On Sunday, then, a brighter day in prospect. It should be less windy, but it will be quite on the cool side again. Highs will be mostly in the 30s, though we may touch some lowest 40-degree temperatures in the high part of the afternoon. A little bit of cloudiness during the afternoon hours, but it should be a much less windy day. 37 to 39, the expected high temperature tomorrow here in the Queen City. During Sunday night, then, going back to a circulation that is a little bit more of a warming trend, and this should bring us in some increasing cloudiness on Monday, but we should be avoided as far as the rain or showers are concerned until Monday night or Tuesday. However, some of those rains may overrun the lakes area during the day on Monday, and that could touch the northern borders of Ohio and Indiana. Largely, then, summing it up, fair skies starting tonight on the cool side and then warming slowly starting late Sunday into Monday. 31, that current Cincinnati temperature, and that's the weather for the moment.
This is the nation station, WLW in Cincinnati. From our WLW Communications Exchange, the late regional news and weather, Jim Bollinger reporting. Governors of the three-state area of Ohio, Kentucky, and Indiana have joined with those of other states with a proclamation that Monday be an official day of mourning in the death of John F. Kennedy. All state buildings have been ordered closed for the day. Officials in the state houses of the 3 states have joined with the superintendents of public instruction to suggest the schools also be closed. In Cincinnati and Hamilton County, other adjacent as well as other schools will be closed. Stores in Cincinnati and northern Kentucky will remain closed until 1 p.m. on Monday. We'll have other news from around the area, but first let's check on the weather. From our Wlw Radar Weather Service, meteorologist Frank Pierce. Frank?
Good evening, everyone. Fair skies continue to move out of the west and northwest, bringing a clearing trend throughout almost all of the area of Indiana now and spreading into at least the western half of Kentucky, moving right up to the western borders of Ohio and continuing to move on eastward. So we should be losing the cloudiness during the night tonight, but not before we get a few flurries of snow over in the eastern counties of Ohio and into the Appalachian Mountains of Pennsylvania, West Virginia, and New York. No accumulations there, of course, as the winds continue to diminish across our area and the cool air continues to move on deeper into the region. Right now, the air is quite cool indeed, 27 degrees around Terre Haute, Indiana, and at Indianapolis, Indiana, a couple of the cooler spots in our listening area under clear skies. Louisville and Lexington now are both clear, their temperatures both 31. And at Hamilton, partly cloudy skies and 31, 36 at Portsmouth, Ohio, and still cloudy there, however. In Cincinnati, we're 31, at Dayton, Ohio, 32, Columbus also at 34, as is Lima, and the hours are all under cloudy skies. The WLW weather forecast is for a break in this cloudiness now during the night tonight, and clearing in most sections by early tomorrow morning as temperatures continue to cool off. They'll be rather slow to cool, but the early morning temperatures will generally be in the 20s and the low 30s, and we're looking for some good freezing temperatures across the region, including the Cincinnati area, which will be down to about 24 degrees tomorrow morning. During the day Sunday, it looks like a brighter one in store and much less windy, but even at that, the temperature is not rising very much. They should stay mostly in the 30s, possibly a few 40s along and mostly south of the Ohio River. We're calling it 37 for the high temperature in Cincinnati tomorrow. By Sunday night, then, around to southwesterly winds that mean a warming trend for our region. And then on Monday, some increasing cloudiness finally working its way back into the area that'll bring rain across the Great Lakes area and possibly the northern third of Ohio and Indiana. And Monday we'll see the temperatures going up some 10 degrees. Monday night to Tuesday, we can look for a little rain spreading throughout the region again. So we're going just a fair condition here now, and on the cool side, warming up about Monday to Tuesday. On the eastern side at Washington, D.C. now, we notice the temperature is at 56 degrees. The showers have passed out with the leading edge of cool air into the Atlantic Ocean, and skies have turned fair over Washington, D.C. now. That's a condition that will largely stay that way through Sunday, and then with sunny skies over the Washington, D.C. area on Monday, we can look for a little bit of windy conditions, but temperatures warming up into the upper 40s and low 50s. 31, the current Cincinnati temperature, and that's the weather.
All flames have been reported as extinguished in the 51-car derailment of a Pennsylvania freight train near Columbus, Ohio, Friday night. Flames erupted from the wreckage, apparently from ruptured chemical and petroleum product tank cars that were part of the train. No injuries were reported either in the derailment or the subsequent fire today. A mechanical failure, possibly a broken journal, is tentatively blamed for the wreck, which railroad officials said would reach some $600,000. The death toll in the fire at Norwalk, Ohio, has reached 63 in what has been called the nation's worst fire since 95 school children perished in a Chicago school some 5 years ago. The wind-fed blaze early in the morning of a nursing home trapped many of the residents, some of them invalids and 100 years old. 3 employees and 21 residents of the home were rescued. The speed with which the flames engulfed the building and burned out telephone lines prevented immediate call for aid. Officials of the State Fire Department said cause of the fire has not yet been learned, and an investigation is being launched. The Toledo Blade will publish a near normal Sunday edition tomorrow, the first paper to be printed in a week, ending a week-long blackout of printed news in the area. The Newspaper Guild chapter suddenly decided to return to work, and the publishing firm reached an agreement with other unions to resume operations tonight. A bus strike threat still looms at Oxford, with some 9,000 students at Miami University already starting to make alternate plans to go home for the Thanksgiving holiday later this coming week. The New York Central Railroad has agreed to place special Oxford, Middletown, Cleveland trains in service to ease the situation. In the past, the bus line had provided special buses for the mass holiday departure. Ohio bus line drivers and mechanics have set midnight tonight as their strike deadline. The last offer by the company was rejected earlier this week. In Kentucky, the opening of the Burley market throughout the entire 8-state Burley belt has been delayed until Tuesday due to the death of President Kennedy. Kentucky Banking Commissioner said banks in the Bluegrass State may close or remain open at their discretion Monday. However, time off for employees to attend memorial services was suggested. For the most part, indications are that banks will remain closed. Lexington, Kentucky Mayor Richard Colbert said the city's government offices there would be closed from 11 a.m. until 1 p.m. on Monday. Most business places in that city, Lexington, will follow the same pattern. However, schools in Lexington will be open. Memorial services are to be held at the schools. Flemingsburg, Kentucky officials still remain up in the air about their water situation. Word from the Federal Aid Agency said they would provide the equipment to pump water to the city and pipe through which it can be carried. However, installation and transportation would be a city expense, which the mayor termed as too costly. At present, the city is paying $400 a day to haul in about 140,000 gallons of water. Mayor James Crane said either the city or the state of Kentucky would have to pay the added cost, which he said was unreasonable. A 73-year-old man was struck and killed in Louisville today, raising the state traffic toll for the year to 736 compared to 715 at this time a year ago. In the Hoosier State, the Indiana Supreme Court has upheld the property rights of a New Albany woman in a suit on the city's zoning ordinance. That ordinance did not promote the public health, safety, morals, or welfare. Mrs. Mary Kohler had sought to build a shopping center, but was halted by the zoning ordinance. The decision, which directed only to Mrs. Kohler's property, may have statewide implications. The Indiana Public Service Commission has ordered the Central Indiana Gas Company at Muncie to refund $1.25 million to its customers. The refunds were ordered during the period January 1961 through April 30th, 1962, and will affect gas users in 27 cities. The action resulted from a refund given the Muncie utility by the Panhandle Eastern Pipeline Company by order of the Federal Power Commission. Indiana department store sales have slipped 1% in the past week from the same period a year ago. At the same time, total sales have dropped 6% from last week. Nationally, sales were reported as up 5%. Indiana's traffic toll continues to mount, with a 20-year-old Greenfield, Indiana woman killed this afternoon, raising the total to at least 1,166, compared to 1,080 a year ago. The toll rapidly appears headed for an all-time record total. A Shelbyville, Indiana youth, a passenger in a car being pursued by police at a high rate of speed, was killed earlier in the day. Indianapolis Lodge of the Fraternal Order of Police have started a fund for the family of the Dallas, Texas policeman who was slain while in pursuit of the accused assassin of President Kennedy, and they urge all police departments in the state and the nation to join the campaign. The Indianapolis Lodge is believed to be the first to start the fundraising campaign for the widow and 3 children. All major downtown stores and those with suburban outlets will be closed until 1 p.m. in Monday here in the Cincinnati area. The University of Cincinnati has suspended all classes for Monday in both its day and evening colleges. All schools, we report, Here in the Cincinnati area of Hamilton County and also in Claremont County, the Milford schools and the public offices will be closed. Our Lady of Cincinnati College will be closed. Miami University will have classes on an abbreviated schedule. Xavier University will hold classes Monday morning. Mass will be celebrated at noon. Classes will resume in the afternoon. And that's the latest news from our WLW Comics, Jim Bollinger reporting. Wlw-Radio in Cincinnati and the Crosley Broadcasting Corporation join with President Johnson in urging Americans to assemble in their respective churches to pay homage of love and reverence to Mr. Kennedy's memory. Tomorrow, we remind you, at 8 o'clock Sunday morning, we will resume our nationwide coverage through the facilities of NBC. This is the Nation Station, WLW in Cincinnati.